Welcome, gentle listener. I am Baldermort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the factions, forces, and faces of the Warhammer 40k setting, the grim darkness of the far future, where there is no time for peace, there is only time for war. And today, I now enter a brief period where I take a rest, regroup, and start writing even more. But I do need a break. Alas, I have the urge to do some personal projects in writing, possibly even a novel. So we'll be attempting that in my period off. No, it can't be Warhammer. But hopefully some will think it of worth, if I manage that first draft. A dream for decades, and I have few of those left, so best get on with it, as they say. You never know what you can do until you try. Hence, as usual, I will be releasing some compilations of my own wee stories to tide me over. YouTube can be a harsh taskmaster, and videos need to be uploaded continuously. So, in this period, I put out collections to paint or sleep with. I hope you enjoy this compilation for what it is, and I thank you, gentle listener, for all of your support over the year and years. You truly have changed everything in my life. Thank you. I can only hope that I have made some kind of beneficial impact in yours. Now, to the stories. The Battle of Amarah was to prove a crucial turning point in the history of the Orphean War, and the largest confirmed single loss of life in a confined engagement within living memory in the Segmentum Tempestus. It would also become the crux of what has since become known as the Orpheus Salvation Campaign, the protracted counter-assault to hold back and defeat the Necron onslaught across the sector after the disastrous first stages of the Orphean War. Eve of Destruction. The onslaught had consumed more than half of the inhabited star systems that made up the Orpheus sector, and had done so in just less than 100 standard days, sowing panic and terror on a vast scale, and ending the lives of billions. In doing so, the invaders had thrown all before them into disarray, savage battles becoming desperate retreats, and retreats becoming anarchic routs, as the sector's forces were overcome and scattered. The invaders ravaging ever onwards to victory after victory. No Imperial force available was able to do more than delay the enemy's onslaught or stay their progress. Then, seemingly inexplicably, they stopped. At Amarah, under the oversight of Sector Commander and Governor-General Calibron Larn and his military council, all forces that could be availed upon were concentrated and rallied with haste, none knowing just how long this pause in the attack would continue. As time wore on and no attack came, Larn's growing paranoia and seeming insatiability, at the time unknown in its particular cause, weighed heavily in the battle plans and dispositions of forces that were enacted in Amarah's defense. The out-of-sector reinforcements that now began to arrive in response to Leon's cause were largely channeled directly to the build-up at Amarah. Other local units from the worlds of the Arcantis cluster and eastern portions of the sector, as yet untouched by war, were stripped wholesale of their defensive positions and likewise redirected to Amarah, weakening the protection of their home worlds. An act which greatly damaged morale and planetary political stability, leading to outright mutiny on several occasions, which needed to be brutally dealt with by the Commissariat. Within a quarter span of a standard year, the forces arrayed at Amarah had grown to colossal proportions. With over 19 million Imperial Guardsmen in place, with perhaps 10 times that amount of reservists and militia raised under emergency edict and armed and equipped with Acadian pattern to the strictest provisions of the Departamento Munitorum. Foremost amongst the off-world Imperial Guard formations in martial power, and one of the last contingents to arrive in system, were 2 million troops drawn from the Death Corps of Krieg, spearheaded by the veteran 17th Line Corps under the command of Marshal Karis Venner. Additionally, several Space Marine chapters had answered the Orphean sector's call to arms, including the entirety of the Minotaur's chapter, its vanguard elements now sweeping through the northern Orpheus sector alongside a company of the Marauders chapter, which also deployed to the Amarah system, while detachments of the Red Ceres and Nemesis chapters were known to be en route. The armada massed in Amarah's void space at this time was no less impressive, comprising several hundred escort-class vessels and more than 60 rated cruisers and capital vessels of the Imperial Navy, including several Primus-grade battleships and 4 Space Marine battle barges with the ancient and storied Arica Dominus as their flagship. Seldom in the history of the Imperium had such overwhelming forces been seen in the defense of but a single star system. As the silence of the invaders drew out and time passed, the rush to defend Amarah seemed no longer so pressing, and calls for more immediate action to meet the enemy's forces became common, but Larn and his council remained adamant. An absolute moratorium was imposed on any attempt to counterattack into the lost regions of Orphean space, or even conduct reconnaissance in force to ascertain if Imperial survivors still fought on isolated and alone, or even to espy enemy movements and strength. A dark veil had been drawn across the sector's lost worlds, which Larn and his confidants seemed loath to disturb. The Battle of Amarah began without preamble or warning. No deep-range augury foretold of their Necrons' coming, and no astropath or seer prophesied their presence in the currents of the Empyrean. At 1534202 local timescape, a massive gravitational flux sprang into being near the Amarah system, its shock waves causing the sun to violently eject plasma and radiation into space in a series of massive solar flares. The fury of the injured star was such it reached as far as the orbit of the system's innermost planet, Auric, and flash incinerated everything on its day side in an instant. Across the Amarah system, sensor nets and Auspex scanners were blinded, Vox traffic was drowned out, and unshielded instruments rendered useless in the electromagnetic howl of the tormented star. Such was the confusion and tumult created by the sudden solar storms that it was not until the Sentinel-4 battle station in deep orbit around Amarah Prime exploded in a rapidly expanding ball of burning glass and molten wreckage that it was realized that the long-looked-for attack had finally come. The Necron host had unleashed their wrath. The vast Imperial battle fleet on station further out at the fleet anchorage of Lamon and Amarah 3, posted at what conventional wisdom dictated was the optimum location to best intercept ships translated into the system from the warp, quickly brought backup systems and optical surveyors online to view the destruction. They found to their horror the image of a black fleet of unknown vessels silhouetted against the burning death throes of the battle station. The ships traveling at such near impossible speeds, they were in range of Amarah Prime in moments, and there was nothing that could be done to stop them, nor even time to give a warning. The enemy had appeared within the walls. As the fleet raised its mighty engines from their idling slumber, a process that would take time that Amarah Prime could ill afford, the Arica Dominus and her sister ships were forced to watch impotently, as flashes of golden and emerald light flickered around Amarah, as orbital minefields and weapons platforms were swept aside by the black scythe blade and spear-like shapes of the alien invaders. Systematically, Amarah Prime was stripped of the defenses that so much blood, treasure, and time had forged, and Sentinel-2, then Sentinel-1, each a battle station with the firepower of an entire cruiser squadron in its own right, were blasted into a pyre of burning wreckage and left to hang like fiery omens in Amarah Prime's night sky. The capital world of the Orpheus sector lay open for attack. By the time the orbital defense batteries that shielded its hive cities and the missile silos concealed beneath its grey seas began to open fire wildly into the skies above, the enemy was already at Amarah's gates. Dark and unnatural storms boiled in the skies above, riven with vivid and corpuscent lightning, while eerie flashes of pale radiance flickered in the shadows between the high spires and tunnels and passages deep below ground. Tactical voxnets, still mired in howling static and interference, were suddenly swamped with reports of attacks both from the ground and the air. In the wide ceremonial plazas of the Caloshin hive, a spectral army of blackened iron had appeared between the lightning strikes and was advancing through the city streets, slaughtering all before it. At Dunrat starport, swarms of ravenous metallic insects in their thousands had erupted from the subterranean access tunnels below, devouring everything in their path and tearing apart the troop shuttles and gunships on their slipways from within. Elsewhere in the high city of New Vasburg, the largest of Amarah Prime's arcologies, was to be destroyed from the air, as the sleek shapes of Doom-size and Night Shroud-class attack ships fell upon it from the storm-racked skies above. The antimatter bomb released as lightless black containment spheres by the Night Shrouds shattered on contact with their 4 targets, ripping them into oblivion and rending great wounds into the spires, which, so undermined, began to topple and crash down, bringing untold carnage upon the multitudes trapped inside. The half-submerged complexes of the Tritonus hive were likewise soon undone. The city's defenses had long relied upon its labyrinth of flood passageways and sub-levels to impede and confuse any attacker, but found that they were poor barricades against the machine-dead things that came for them. Creatures with no need to breathe, and to whom darkness was refuge. Assailed by mournful funeral barks that rose from the black waters bearing silent legions of skeletal, metallic warriors and scissor-handed fiends that crawled from the shadows to do murder. Soon, the air domes and coral-like heights of Tritonus were also splintered and falling, its watery streets echoing with the screams of the dying. Beyond the cities that were the invaders' primary targets, military outposts were also soon attacked by the relentless Necron invaders. The foremost of these, the polar bastion Militaris, a linchpin of the planet's defenses, was suddenly besieged by a phalanx of hulking war machines that hovered soundlessly over the ice floes. Seemingly unstoppable by shot and shell, they closed in relentlessly, tearing apart the mountain holdfast with lashing blasts of energy, and unleashed waves of seismic force that brought down the granite faces of the fortress's curtain walls as if they were made of sand. The kilometers of prefabricated barrack blocks on the Markovan Peninsula, built to house nearly 1 million guardsmen, were simply annihilated from existence, blazing lambent shafts of light descending from orbit and leaving nothing but fine white ash and fused silica glass where once a vast army had stood rallying for war. Outmatched by an enemy that seemed to be suddenly everywhere and had the power to simply materialize out of thin air, the defenders of Amarah, though thrown into disorder, nevertheless fought back hard against the invader. At Caloshin, the massacring legions were met by the tanks of the Tekhan 234th Armored Battalion, who quickly learned that even the small arms of the invaders proved lethal to their heaviest armor at close range. Knowing that to remain on the battlefield would mean swift destruction, the commanders of the battalion therefore pulled their vehicles back into the wide concourses where they could hope to engage their foe at range. In places, almost jamming the area between the Hab spires with Lehman Russes drawn up in staggered lines abreast, Manticore and Basilisk artillery tanks behind them providing barrage fire support. At the first sight of the unliving ranks of the Necron warriors stalking towards them, the Tekhan opened fire in an unrelenting barrage of shell fire at long range, through which nothing could hope to survive. Even as rank upon rank were blasted apart, and scattered warriors were sent spinning into fragments, More took their place, and yet more still dragged themselves up from the broken ground and began to reassemble themselves to haul their metal bodies forward again. The Tekkan, seeing with horror that their fury was doing no more than holding the tide back, could not relent their barrage and keep firing until their cannon barrels began to glow dull red with heat, as shells were brought up with back-breaking haste to feed the guns. A savage stalemate of sorts had been achieved. It was one the Tekkan officers knew they could not sustain for long. But little did they know that they would not get the chance to see how far their determination and munitions could last against so implacable a foe. For the valiant guardsmen of Tekkan, death came from above and below. Testimony from the single survivor of the action, then employed as part of the shell-carrying train, reports that the danger went unnoticed at first, owing to a thunderous din of their own guns. The first he saw of their plight was when a lance of burning heat, like the blast from a melter gun, only far more focused and prolonged, instantly incinerated the troops in front of him and bisected a sentinel power loader nearby in a single sweeping arc. Back attributes to luck the fact that he and his fellows were on the return to retrieve more shells, or the munitions would have surely ignited and he would have been instantly killed. He described a huge black shape buzzing past directly over his head as he threw himself into cover, and looking up in shock, he saw the sides of the spire towers around the armored column crawling, with multi-segmented robotic insects of nightmarish size. Identified by the logisters of the Ordo Xenos as acanthrites, these machine constructs propelled themselves downwards onto the trapped Tekkan forces on tenebrous wings of shadowy force, slicing apart armored vehicles with their cutting beams, before descending to smash and hack apart the survivors with bladed limbs and energy-wreathed stingers. Anarchy quickly descended on the Tekkan as, trapped so closely to each other, their tanks could not maneuver or bring their weapons to bear without hitting one another and their own troops, with no less than general slaughter ensuing. Tekkan commando units attached to the armored battalion sought to counter the attack with concentrated bursts of hell gun fire and man-portable plasma weaponry, but this counterattack was quickly overwhelmed when huge, rapidly moving, arthropoid-like constructs erupted from the ground beneath the Tekkan and sealed the trap. These killing machines, moving with blurring speed, were able to pass through solid matter at will. Swiftly, they completed the massacre, smashing through the remaining battle tanks, the carcasses of the Tekkan guardsmen dismembered and sent spinning away as the killing machines tore past. The entire 234th Battalion met its end in a span of no greater than 20 standard minutes, with Trooper Yeon Bak surviving by crawling into a sewer culvert and being swept away, later to be summarily executed for cowardice in the face of the enemy. Krieg. In the days following the initial assault, Amarah Prime had been blasted into a burning ruin, and each of the main hives had fallen to the invaders, the Necron hosts taking no prisoners and offering no quarter. Imperial resistance, however, was far from entirely spent, and as the havoc of the initial assault passed, ad hoc formations and rallying points soon formed on the ruins and in the areas spared either by accident or by design from the destruction that had been visited upon the world. Out on the Karalsa industrial plains, which ranged for tens of kilometers to the west of the shattered ruins at New Varsberg Hive, the death corps of Krieg were waiting. A late arrival to the muster at Amarah, and with their reputation preceding them. The Death Corps had been deployed to several out-hive areas across the planet, well away from the local forces' barrack stations. On the Karalsa plains, the 17th Line Corps had taken over an area of 100 square kilometers of warehousing and manufactura to house their forces. Finding these structures far less secure than was meted by their doctrine, they proceeded to exploit the underground utility tunnels that crisscrossed the area, setting their engineers to further expand them to create arms dumps and refuges. When the onslaught came, This foresight saw the Line Corps survive almost unscathed by the initial attack, and once the firestorm had passed, they emerged from their improvised bunkers in their tens of thousands into the smoking ruins, resolute in their determination to drive the invaders back. The Death Corps first dispersed into the wreckage of the industrial plain, sweeping methodically across the shattered ground, engaging the enemy, linking up with other Imperial surviving groups, and recovering armor and munitions wherever they could be found. It was Marshal Venner of the Death Corps who took charge of the battlefield at this point, ordering the execution of several senior officers of the Orphean Guard he considered had failed in their duties, and offering others the chance for glorious martyrdom in the front lines. Venner's command quickly grew to encompass over 200,000 guardsmen, as well as a dozen scratch-built squadrons of attack aircraft formed from a score of decimated formations, now dispersed into smaller groups for their protection, and using cleared roadway concourse designed for macro-crawlers as airstrips. The disciplined Death Corps troops, veterans of such broken battlefields as Amarah had become, used the shattered cityscapes as cover from which to fight, using every tumble-down ruin as an improvised strongpoint, and concealing snipers and lookouts amidst the mounds of the dead. In the days that followed, fighting against the Necron forces was fierce, the armored bodies of the enemy providing all but impervious to lasfire, and their implacable war machines preternaturally resistant to most heavy weapons in the Imperial arsenal. The Death Corps, however, more than matched their relentless foe with their determination to fight, no matter the odds, and quickly they shifted tactics to a combination of long-ranged indirect bombardments with artillery and extreme close assaults, denying the Necron's own long-range firepower as much as possible, seeking to overwhelm the foe with sheer numbers and bloody determination. These tactics met with great success, but often came at a very high cost in lives. Likewise, their combat engineers, skilled in generations of tunnel fighting, used seismic detectors to shield their bunkers and tunnels from the ravening assault of the Necron's canoptic scarab swarms, with flamer and melter squads kept in permanent readiness to respond to any sudden incursion from below. Marshal Venner knew that such gains as his forces had made were at best transitory, and with no hope of reinforcements arriving, and with the Necrons in command of much of the planet's surface, it was only a matter of time before his forces were isolated, surrounded, and destroyed as soon as they were deemed a sufficient threat. Venner decided that rather than see his command bled and destroyed without gain, he would instead attack and pursue martyrdom in the glorious destruction of the Emperor's enemies. All he needed was a target, and he would soon be provided with one. Reconnaissance by elements of the Minotaur's chapter, trapped on the planet's surface during the attack, had determined that in the rubble of New Varsburg Hive, something alien had manifested in the darkness. Where wreckage had been strewn hours previously, a step pyramid of strangely angled green-black stone, riven with veins of pulsing emerald light, now rose up into the night, drawing bolt after bolt of lightning from the troubled skies above to strike its apex and cause it to burn with glimmering ghost fire. Around this pyramid had formed lesser citadels of the same maleficent stone, these being studded with arcane weapons emplacements and strange battlements connected to the main structure by angular trenches filled with glowing fog. Around the pyramid complex, the skeletal figures of Necrons moved in tireless patrol, and tides of scarabs and other constructs swarmed in and out, dragging a multitude of corpses and wreckage fragments with them to feed the pyramid's hunger. Against this stronghold of the enemy, Marshal Venner ranged his forces for attack, even as intelligence came in from forward observers of alien stars being seen in the rent-open storms above the pyramid, through which blasted flares of emerald energy that surged up from its apex with deafening reports. As they moved into position, each of the men of the Death Corps' assault brigades knelt in silent ordered ranks, crouching in the rubble and ash, waiting for the call to battle as the alien lightning flashed and flickered in the shrouded night. Between the ruins in which the Death Corps marshalled and the Necron defences lay was a rough kilometre of open ground, blasted flat and scorched, marking the killing zone which they would have to cross to reach their objective. The signal was given at last, and the Death Corps rose as one, and began to advance across slowly, evenly gathering pace as they left the rubble and entered the blasted ground. Immediately, the curving arcs of sentry pylons materialized on the walls of the citadels and turned to track the advancing army, arcs of power visibly flaring along the strange Necron battlements. Then the killing began. Howling beams of emerald energy blasted great swathes of men from existence, while Tesla cannons spat volleys of lightning that left anything they touched as blazing cinders. Hundreds fell in the first moments, but the Death Corps line did not waver in its advance, and now, from deep in the ruins behind them, their own guns spoke. Impassively, forward artillery observers had noted the range and dispositions of the Necrons' own heavy weapons, and marked them for destruction. Venner had ordered that no munitions were to be spared, no cannon left in reserve, and the Death Corps basilisks and praetors answered his call with a furious bombardment, sending tons of shells into the air to fall like deadly rain on their targets. Instantly, the pyramid and its sub-citadels were wreathed in a mantle of flame as hundreds of shells burst along the alien construct. The pyramid flickered for a moment like a mirage on the horizon, before becoming solid once again. One of its outlying obelisk towers blasted to fragments in a stream of arcing lightning. Soon, as the bombardment lashed out again, great chunks of black masonry were torn free from the structure, and an eerie howl cut across the battlefield, clearly audible even over the thunder of the shellfire. The Necron firepower was quickly redirected upwards, sweeping the skies and blasting apart the shells before they could reach their target. And in the respite, the Death Corps pressed their advantage, surging forwards while Venner's tank companies, held back until now, roared forth from the rubble at flank speed through the Death Corps lines towards their objective. As the Imperial troops closed to a few hundred meters, the ground before the citadel burst open, disgorging murderous canoptic constructs directly into the oncoming Death Corps troops. The huge articulated bodies of the stalkers rose up and tore through the lines, whilst hundreds of smaller scarabs dragged men down, stripping the flesh from their bones. They were met with bayonet and flashgun, flamer and frag grenade, and the Death Corps flowed like a tide round the killing machines, while the tank companies entered range and opened fire with their battle cannons into the ranks of the shambling Necron warriors that were beginning to stream from the citadels. On the left flank, a squadron of Macarius Omega plasma tanks unleashed blasts like miniature suns towards the defensive pylons, heedless of their overheating cannon in their determination to strip the citadel of its defenses. While on the right, Centaur carriers sped forth through a storm of Gorse fire, which blasted scores of them to shrapnel in order to deploy their quad launchers as close as possible to the enemy. Thousands fell. Tanks erupted into fire, and a blizzard of shells was hurled against the black pyramid, which began to break and crack, smoke billowing and actinic lightning playing sickly across its splintering surface. Behind the Imperial lines, the companies of troops left behind to defend the artillery position found themselves beset in a desperate battle to stave off twisted, blade-handed flares that came for them from the shadows, just as Necron attack craft shrieked from the skies to strafe them into oblivion. The squadrons of Imperial Lightnings and Avengers that tore through the night to intercept the lethal night sides of the Necrons were few, but bravely, they dove straight into the heart of the enemy squadrons, their weapons blazing in the darkness, each pilot commending their soul to the Emperor, and knowing that this would be their final battle. The die was cast. The battle was held in the balance, and there could be no holding back. Already, tens of thousands lay dead on the blasted plain before him, but Venner did not falter in ordering forth the second wave. Raising his sword high and leading the charge himself across the deadly ground, the Death Corps filled the battlefield like a living tide of steel and fire, and crushed and toppled the remaining canoptic stalkers that barred their path, trampling the scattered scarabs into the earth. The Death Corps reached the outer citadels of the pyramid complex, just as their own shellfire began at last to falter. But for the Necrons, it was too late. The enemy was already upon them, the human soldiers swarming like ants across the alien fortifications. Surrounded, the Necron warriors were brought down in murderous crossfires, and the machine creatures were driven back and destroyed one by one. As for every Krieg the Necrons slaughtered, a dozen more took their place. Everywhere across the structure, breacher charges were slammed into place and melter bombs were hurled into enemy conduits and cracks in the armored edifice. The violent detonation of the Black Pyramid blinded onlookers 5 kilometers distant and carved an ash-white crater out of the wasteland that was very visible to vessels in orbit above the battle-savaged world. Although elsewhere, the Imperial defenders also saw degrees of success, holding off, if not repelling, the invaders. The Necron invasion had been murderously effective. Each of the 3 major hive cities was in ruins. The planet's principal starport was overrun, and its keystone defense facilities had been reduced to rubble. The death toll had climbed into billions, and Amarah Prime burned. The Minotaur and the Reaper. With its lethal cargo deployed to the surface, and the conquest of the planet well underway, the Necron fleet had turned its attentions again to interplanetary space, leaving Amarah Prime covered in boiling black storms and riven with the fiery streaks of wreckage re-entering its atmosphere in their wake. The Imperial Armada ranged against them, now arrayed in a vast echelon formation and on full burn towards the inner system, detected their movement, and its captains cursed momentarily, believing the invaders would flee before the Armada's cataclysmic gathered might, leaving them no chance to avenge their failure to prevent the Black Fleet from bringing about the deaths of so many on the planet's surface. They were wrong. The Necron ships, turning with almost contemptuous grace, formed themselves into a perfect crescent-shaped attack formation and locked onto a direct intercept trajectory with the heart of the Imperial Armada. Exhibiting sudden unearthly acceleration no human ship could ever hope to match. On the flag bridge of the Apocalypse-class battleship Araka Dominus, Grand Admiral Jorg Carew, Knight Commander of Battlefleet Orpheus, watched the holospheres before him, showing the onrushing enemy with great apprehension. Although his desire to avenge the losses his fleet had suffered in the past months and the affront to the world he had solemnly sworn to protect, unlike many of those under his command, he would not let his wrath blind him. The firepower of the fleet at his disposal was of an unimaginable order of magnitude, and more than capable of shattering entire worlds through brute force alone, a factor he believed his foe was more than aware of. Now, with the Imperial battle auspexes repaired, he could ascertain that the Black Fleet possessed less than a quarter of his own number of vessels and, by Imperial standards, far less in tonnage. The bulk comprising what would comparatively be of the escort class in Imperial terms. The larger vessels, some 20 in number, were, according to the intelligence provided to him by the Ordo Xenos, identified as harvest ships, while the foe matched his 11 greatest warships with 2 monsters of their own. Together, anchoring the center of the attacking crescent, these tomb ships were gigantic, each being over 15 kilometers in span and surmounted with strange pyramid-like structures that threw off incomprehensible energy readings which baffled and alarmed his Magos. They had already been codified, the Sun Killer and the Dead Hand, by the Imperial Strategos, and marked as the highest priority targets to all within the Armada. The force represented the largest concentration of Xenos Necron vessels on record, and Carew determined to give them the respect they deserved. Having conferred with the sinister Asterian Moloch, chapter master of the Minotaur Space Marines, the Minotaur's chapter fleet, commanded by the lumbering relic assault ship Daedalus Crater, itself shielded by a dozen escort strike cruisers, had deployed into a second echelon, some way behind the Armada's main line of battle, poised either to deliver a killing blow after the lines had crashed, or to intercept any breakthrough force were the enemy's plans to punch straight through rather than engage. To his own command, he issued the direct order to all vessels to maintain formation and engage only as directed, on pain of death. And although the captains of many battle-hungry destroyers and cruisers balked at the order, they knew that their lives would be forfeit to their own shipboard commissars should they disobey. With frightening speed, the Necron fleet had closed the empty void between them and was entering extreme weapons range before any more orders could be given or carried out. The Imperial Armada, though, was first to speak its wrath. Hundreds of torpedoes spat from the launch tubes of the massed destroyers, frigates and cruisers of the Imperial force, blazing straight and true on pillars of fire towards the Black Fleet that awaited them. The Necrons came on undeterred, and as the torpedo swarm drew closer, they made no attempt to alter course or evade, and as hundreds of thousands of kilometers of distance was eaten away to tens of thousands, no avoidance maneuvers nor counter-fire issued from the ominous Xenos warships. On the flag bridge of the Arachdominus, all looked on in breathless silence as the torpedoes entered terminal range. Suddenly, where hundreds of blue icons had flickered on the holospheres tracking the projectile's flight, red alarm glyphs now flashed frantically and simply disappeared. Scores of torpedoes simply ceased to function, rendered inert and powerless by some agency the Imperial battle auspexes could not even detect, while others self-destructed or spun wildly off course as if blinded. The few that flew true were simply avoided with contemptuous ease by the Necron vessels, which sped past them at unguessable velocities, or vented their atomic spite uselessly against the impassive black hulls of the great tomb ships. Too few to have any real effect. Still, the Necron ships, blacker yet against the darkness of the cold void, came on. Within mere moments, the two fleets neared the edge of lance range, and the Necrons fired. On the bridges of the Imperial ships, alarm sirens howled as massive gravitational distortions were detected, hurtling towards them at speeds barely below that of light. And too late, the struggling machine spirits and cogitators of the Imperial ships identified them for what they were: fragments of dead stars. These bolts of oblivion shattered void shields in bright actinic flashes and tore open the ships within with savage ease. And up and down the Imperial line, ships both great and small simply flashed out of existence. Alongside the Arachdominus, the battlecruiser Richtenbach, which had served the Imperium since before the Great Crusade, was struck amidships and exploded, bathing the Admiral's flagship in fire and debris, shaking her to the core. Despite the tumult around him, Carew issued the orders for the Armada to come about to broadside and fire at will, and the closing void between the two fleets became a blinding storm of blazing lance beams and plasma fire, hurtling macro cannon shells and roaring missiles, whilst the Necrons answered with a fury all of their own, as blasts of amber and emerald light flickered out to splinter hulls and strip away decks. The two fleets interpenetrated and parted, raking each other mercilessly as they passed, and Carew watched in horror as a hollow sphere resolved the chaotic details of the battle into some semblance of order. The casualty list flickered on it as strange Mechanicus cant runes, which only a trained and augmented eye had a hope of being able to interpret at such speed. Fully a quarter of his ships were registered as destroyed or crippled already, compared to so few of the enemy. So very few. Horror mounted on horror for the Admiral as the Necron fleet, having flown past, arrested its inertia and turned back upon their course, coming right back at the Imperial ships from behind. It was an utter impossibility, and yet it happened before his disbelieving eyes. The second Necron attack run was even more devastating than the first. The Imperial ships, caught unexpectedly from behind in their vulnerable rear arcs, blind spots created by their own drive flares, and already reeling in many cases from battle damage, were easy prey, and dozens died before they realized the danger or heard Carew's emergency order to break formation. The Retribution-class battleship Talisman of Grace was caught between the Sun Killer and sheared in half by its Gorse rays, whilst the heavy cruiser Pergatus was pulled apart mercilessly by a pack of Necron raiders like a wounded herd animal caught between predator beasts. The Armada's line of battle quickly fractured and broke apart, ships flaring and exploding like stars in the darkness. The survivors now lashing vainly all about them with broadside and battery fire, or spilling fighters and bombers into the void, often to be cut apart by the defensive fusillades put up by their own brethren. The Amarah Dominus herself turned as closely as her expert crew could grant her, and caught a harvest ship broadside, the black hull rippling like water, and finally failing before the fury of energy poured into it. The harvest ship detonated with a flash of pale green light, leaving nothingness in its wake. But the roars of triumph from the flagship's bridge were short-lived, as a venerable battleship was rocked anew, as a triad of Necron raiders passed close alongside her. Her void shields down, the dirge ships hammered her from stem to stern, gutted her starboard lance batteries, and consumed her main engine deck in fire. Unable to answer her helm, the Amarah Dominus tumbled wildly in the darkness, the bodies of her crew and frozen air trailing behind her as she fell. Through the carnage, the Necron ships wheeled and fell like carrion birds at the feast. The two great tomb ships glided majestically and inviolate through the heart of the storm, annihilating anything that came near, while the pilots and crew of lesser craft that drew close were driven mad with fear, or found their ships had become cold tombs for them, their power draining away to nothing. It was into this bloody melee that the Minotaur's chapter fleet plunged headlong. Having observed the battle on his own holosphere, Asterion Moloch, the bleak master of the Minotaurs, quickly realized that engaging the Necron ships with their superior firepower, maneuverability and range was suicidal folly, and instead issued orders for close assault without quarter or reservation of force. Their target was to be the Dead Hand, which the machine animus of his own ancient assault ship had discerned had been the first vessel to leave the orbit of stricken Amarah, and the first to fire upon the fleet. This Moloch knew in his warrior's heart was the master of the foe, their flagship, the throne of their commander, and it was this the Minotaurs meant to destroy. Adopting an attack formation in the shape of a bull's head, with the Daedalus crater forming the protected skull, the chapter's 3 battle barges the jaw, and its 8 strike cruisers the horns, the chapter fleet smashed into the heart of the battle, engines at full burn and fire held until the last moment. As they unleashed hail from their bombardment cannons and plasma batteries, the chapter's war vessels did so heedless of whatever lay in their path, as stricken Imperial ships caught between them and their goal was shredded, just as were any Necron raiders smashed aside on the fleet's headlong plunge towards the Dead Hand. 2 Necron harvest ships turned and opened fire into the onrushing Space Marine vessels. The battle barge Daughter of Tempus, once the pride of the Lamentor's chapter fleet and taken as a prize during the Badab War, was blasted asunder and fell from the formation, its entire armoured foresection disintegrating in the Necron crossfire. But the Minotaurs did not relent. Even when the Dead Hand's own weapons spoke and shattered the portside hull of the Fidelitas Lambda and sent a trio of strike cruisers into fiery oblivion. At point-blank range, boarding torpedoes, gunships, and Castus assault rams hurtled from the launch bays of the Minotaur's fleet and crashed into the hull of the Dead Hand and its close escorts, the ships at their backs still firing remorselessly at the prey, hoping to open up hull rents for the boarders to exploit. A dozen assault craft managed to pierce the hull skin of the Necron flagship and found within a charnel house of stagnant, blood-reeking air, darkened corridors, and black alien sepulchres. Malevolent scarab engines were everywhere, and wraith machines phased through the solid walls to assault the attackers as antibodies would attack a virus invading a living body. The Minotaurs, implacable and unrelenting, fought on, battling and bleeding for every inch of ground, as every turn of passageway brought fresh enemies looming out of the darkness. One by one, the Space Marines fell, their armor blackened and burned by Gorse rays, bodies punctured and torn apart by the ghost claws of the tomb ship's defenders, until only one squad remained. Terminator Squad Ixtalion, blast-scarred and bloody, at last forced its way into the tomb ship's vast central chamber, a cold and haunted space nearly a kilometre across that lay beneath the black pyramid that crowned the tomb ship. Here, amid the chill mists and circles of strange obelisks, at the centre of ranks of whispering sarcophagi, wreathed in corpuscent ghostlight, arose a great dais upon which stood the terrifying overlord of the Necrons, in a shrouding cloak of raw darkness. It would be the last sight the warriors of Squad Ixalian would see, as a phalanx of Necron Praetorians rose from the shadowed mists and slaughtered them for their transgression. But it would be enough. The signal had been sent. All but close enough now to crash into the tomb ship, the Daedalus Crater, badly wounded and with rents of damage scoring her dense armour, opened fire with her bombardment cannon at point-blank range. Their targeting solutions identified by Squad Ixalian below, the fusillade of macro shells ruptured the dead hand's hull, exposing the vault chamber within to open space in a screaming vortex of decompression. The dead hand bucked away like a wounded animal, one vast arc of its crescent superstructure catching the Daedalus Crater a glancing blow and sending the relic assault ship spinning with the impact. The damage, however, was done. The seamless shell within the tomb ship, otherwise impenetrable to Auspex or target solution, was broken, and in that instant, the ancient teleporter engines of the Daedalus Crater had fired and delivered their baleful cargo. As the pulsing shockwave of the teleport transit cleared, Asteria Moloch and his bodyguard of 30 of his chapter's Terminator armoured veterans, alongside 2 contempted dreadnoughts of the chapter, stood amidst a black gale of venting atmosphere and confronted the lord of the Necron host. Between them was no preamble, no warrior salute or declaration of challenge or intent. Instead, Moloch merely raised his black spear and unleashed its las blast at the sinister figure high on its throne-like dais. The gold and white bolt, strong enough to pierce the armour of a battle tank, struck the machine creature's shoulder and rocked the figure back, but did not more than elicit an eerie hissing howl, not of pain, but of insulted rage. From the cold air, a great glittering cleave-like blade of pale obsidian materialized in the Necron Overlord's outstretched skeletal hand, and he threw himself from the dais like a bolt of thunder, slicing open the first Terminator in his path with a savage backhand blow, as if the warrior's vaunted armour was as nothing. So was the battle joined, and in a moment all the vast chamber was fury, the sound of churning storm bolters and roaring assault cannon bleeding away from the air into the open void above. From the darkness, the Necron Praetorians and Tomb Guardians came, hulking armoured forms twice the height of a man, their gilded and corroded death masks glimmering gold and crimson in the fire-flashed light of the Minotaur's weapons. In their hands they bore arcane staff weapons, blazing with ghostly flame with which to blast their foes to ashes, or great cleaving blades and tall segmented shields able to repel the deadliest fire. Soon, the Minotaurs were hard-pressed, a shrinking circle of warriors who had already accounted for twice their number, only to see the fallen drag themselves back from the ruin and be replaced by another of their kind, stalking implacably from the darkness. Moloch raged and slew as tirelessly as any machine warrior that rose up before him, and with a far greater cold fury. His storm shield resounding with the blows of enemy weapons, while the black spear tirelessly slashed and stabbed, punching through armoured torso and severing mechanical limbs as he went. The Dark Overlord fought and killed his way towards the Minotaur's chapter master, leaving a trail of rent and severed Terminators in his wake, until suddenly the tomb ship shook to a resounding blow, and it began to tilt crazily, the artificial gravity field within it rippling and buckling. The Necron Overlord was thrown unceremoniously to his knees, and looming there above him was ancient Geryon, the contempted dreadnought's great fist raised to strike, the lethal energy field that enwrapped it churning soundlessly in the now airless vault. The hammer blow fell, but the Reaper's blade was there to meet it, and the dreadnought's forearm exploded in flame and spinning shrapnel. The tomb ship tilted further still, and Geryon reeled and staggered, the dreadnought's huge armoured feet skidding and losing purchase. The Overlord sprang bonelessly from the ground, and laid into Geryon with his great blade in a rapid series of two-handed slashes, sending splintered ceramite and showers of sparks fountaining from the wounded dreadnought. Geryon fell, one knee actuator severed, brackish blood and silvered amniotic fluids leaking from the rents in his armor. The Overlord rose up to deliver the final blow, and the black spear found him. Moloch punched the ancient relic weapon clean through the Overlord's back, and it exploded from the ankh glyph that was emblazoned across the Necron's chest, wreathed in pale flame and amber lightning. Transfixed, the Overlord spasmed under the spear, its death mask thrown back as if in a silent scream. Asterian Moloch smashed the Dark Overlord off his spear blade, using his storm shield to deal the blow, just as the tomb ship rocked again with fresh impact. The white flame of plasma fire licking around the aperture in the vault chamber from the void beyond. By a warrior's instinct earned on 1,000 battlefields, Moloch reacted before his conscious mind detected the reaping blade falling from on high, raising his storm shield as the Dark Overlord's blade came down. The ancient device blocking a blow that would have cleaved Moloch's head in two before it finally shorted and spat, quickly coming apart under repeated wild blows of the Necron's glittering blade. The world tilted once more, and they parted, Moloch feeling the burning cold hate of the deathless creature's baleful crimson eyes as the broken skeletal figure retreated into the darkness. The master of the Minotaur's chapter himself was swept out into the void, surrounded by the bodies of his dead warriors, as if caught in a whirlpool. The darkness shimmered as the vast shape of the stricken dead hand turned and blotted out the stars with its transit, and began to accelerate away, revealing the burning hulk of the Minotaur's battle barge, Fidelitas Lambda, behind it. The ship's dying act had been to ram the dead hand, and in doing so, it had at last caused enough damage to force the colossal ship's retreat. With their master's vessel on the move, the Black Fleet disengaged, and driven off but hardly defeated, leaving only death and fire behind them, whilst in a move completely unanticipated, the Sun Killer and a dozen escort raiders unexpectedly split from the body of the Black Fleet and made a landing on the night side of Auric, whose face was soon consumed by dark storms and pulses of unnatural radiance. The rest of the surviving Necron ships and the wounded dead hand simply vanished without trace from the auguries of the handful of Imperial ships still able to track them. 1 second they registered, the next they were gone. The Necron host, if not defeated, had been checked. But for most of the survivors, that was a Pyrrhic victory at best. Battlefleet Orpheus was shattered. Less than 10% of his vessels were still in anything resembling fighting order, and every single one carried the scars of the battle. As to the rest of the armada, it lay in vast arcing clouds of still burning hulks and tumbling debris, a pyre for the once glorious defenders of the sector, visible across the entire star system. Amarah Prime, although rid of its principal invasion force, burned still, and was now the graveyard for billions. Such victories that had been claimed there had been bought at the most terrible price of all. Any surviving Imperial forces were evacuated as quickly as possible from the shambling ruins and pulled back to the outer worlds of Lemon and Calamar to regroup, while the remnants of the civilian population were regrettably left to their fate. The Battle of Amarah was over. Exemplary battles of the Age of Darkness. Assault on Castum Velx. As the Age of Darkness ground ever onwards, the fires of war would spread throughout the entire galaxy, consuming everything in their path. Armies and worlds were reduced to nothing more than ash, in many cases leaving no one alive to bear witness to the sacrifices made or the atrocities committed. During this time, each legion employed unique formations to prosecute their own style of war, whether by choice or through necessity, making use of unconventional, often abhorrent tactics and weapons. Many of these formations would be lost during the dark years following the Horus Heresy, their traditions wiped out, and the last stockpiles of their weapons exhausted. Some, however, have been preserved in these records, that future generations may learn of the terrors unleashed upon the galaxy by the Emperor's turncoat sons and the valiant heroes who stood against them. In late 010, Millennium 31, the Blood Angels Legion, the 9th, came to Talassar, led by Judicia Aster Crone. The sons of Sanguinius followed the decree of Guilliman and orders of their Primarch, one fleet amongst many who sought to acquire a panacea for the Ultramarines Legion's losses. They descended upon Talassar in full combat drop, 9 gunships and a dozen Xiphons breaking through the planet's rain-heavy atmosphere, carrying 150 legionaries gathered from the orphaned remnants of companies that had merged from the carnage of Cygnus. The flight of aircraft swept across the grasslands of Talassar, then over siege lines constructed on the outskirts of Velx City. There, basilisk tanks of the 209th Gilded Sentinels Solar Auxiliary Cohort, deployed in advance of the Legion's assault, had begun to unleash their fury upon the distant fortress of Castum Velx, a relentless rain of shells hammering into the shields of the bastion. Clusters of red figures stood guard around the grey and gold of the 209th Artillery, a 100-strong Blood Angels reserve deployed as a firebreak against the battle that raged deeper in Velx City. The flight of Blood Angels aircraft moved onwards into the smoke-filled skies above the city streets, passing over the embattled 246th Luminous Host Solar Auxiliary Cohort, bound to the 9th Legion by ancestral bonds and sworn oaths, and the ruins of buildings that had stood tall only hours before. The Auxilia fought those of Talassar who had betrayed their oaths to Emperor and Imperium, militia once loyal to Ultramar, who now proclaimed the Night Lords, the 8th, as their masters. Their new patrons stalked the fringes of combat, packs of midnight-clad legionaries descending to seize victims and drag them into the shadows, the screams of the unfortunate, amplified by Vox networks to ring out louder than the roar of battle itself. Intent upon assaulting Castum Velx, Crone ignored requests for aid from the 246th and words of caution offered by Cafziel, a seraph of the Sanguinary Guard, first amongst the 7 who had been tasked with accompanying the Judicia and now stood with the Blood Angels' rear elements. Records indicate that during the invasion's planning, Cafziel had espoused a slow push into Velx City, followed by the besieging of its fortress, now a den of Night Lords who had seized Talassar as their own. Crone's assault had disregarded such advice and did so again, for the Judicia was a commander of bloody-minded tenacity. The fortress held the prize he had been sent for, and so the fortress was his target. Before taking to his gunship, Crone's final words were that if the Ceres wished to delay, they would stand vigilant against assaults upon the Auxilia rearguard until such time as war had need of them. Castum Velx stood atop a promontory on the coast of Velx City, the shadow of its armoured walls and keep looming over the surrounding city. Walls that had stood for centuries were now pockmarked with craters where artillery shells had struck, and burning gun batteries atop the parapets marked places where the shield aegis had faltered. Yet the defences of Castum Velx had not been fully cast down, and the report of artillery fire was joined by the thundering booms of anti-aircraft guns as the Blood Angels neared. Tracer rounds and flak fire filled the air, a deadly storm of munitions that tore aircraft from the skies, raining flaming debris down upon traitor positions within the city streets. Crone knew not if any passengers had survived the crashes, for the closer they came to Castum Velx, interference escalated across the Vox network, crackling static laced with the echoes of his own words and whispered chants alternating between Low Gothic and Nostraman. Lan Sahai, the chants said, he who had snared them, he who awaited them, he who would flay them. Crone's own Thunderhawk would not survive the fury directed against it. One wing shorn off by a lancing beam of light, and the pilot fighting to angle the plummeting aircraft towards the fortress, in a final effort to land beyond the wall. The gunship fell short, slamming into the causeway that wound its way upwards through the rock face of the promontory, coming to rest 50 meters down from the fortress gate. Crone emerged from the wreckage of his Thunderhawk to see the ruins of his strike force scattered on the approach to the fortress. The full complement of his gunships having been struck from the sky to crash upon the cliff face and the city streets around it. Legionaries were punched from their feet as they sought cover, those too slow torn apart by the hail of bolter fire unleashed by Night Lords atop the distant parapets. Others fell to the shrapnel and rock fragments that sighed through the air as heavy defense guns bombarded the Blood Angels and Rockface. No call for aid could be issued, for the Vox networks were overwhelmed by the traitors' interference shroud. The sole cover for Crone and his warriors was the smouldering debris of their aircraft, scant defense against the guns of the traitors. Into the storm. To advance meant almost certain death for Crone and his warriors, barely 40 in number. To remain was to be picked apart, and to withdraw down the causeway was to accept defeat and still expose themselves to the enemy guns. Seeing no alternative save the slimmest hope of victory, Crone rose from his position behind the crumbled cockpit of his Thunderhawk, enemy fire ricocheting from his power field and armor. The Judiciar raised his shard axe and shouted an order, his words drowned out by the roar of guns around him. Crone charged up the stone causeway, eyes fixed upon the gatehouse at its end. Behind him, his warriors saw their Judiciar rise and joined the charge. As Crone and his warriors moved upwards, the air about them was rent by the wall guns of Castum Velx, anti-air batteries tracking not the ground troops but incoming aircraft. A new flight of Thunderhawks and Storm Eagles vectoring towards the fortress. At their fore came an armored behemoth, a Sokar-patterned stormbird, its wings trimmed with finery of gold and the winged mask of the Sanctuary Guard emblazoned upon its fuselage. A halo of light surrounded the stormbird, its void shields flaring as they absorbed and deflected the fire turned upon it, the defenses ignoring those behind it as they sought to bring down the vast gunship. Missiles and las cannon beams spat forth from the stormbird in answer, a dozen gun batteries reduced to fire and broken metal. Gunships dived in to land at the promontory's base, but the stormbird carried on, streaking over the Blood Angels charging upwards, the causeway already littered with the corpses of a dozen red-armored legionaries. Overhead, the rear door of the stormbird opened, and from it plummeted a towering form. Stone cracked as Amarah crashed into the causeway, the dreadnought-bound warrior standing tall before Crone and his handful of warriors. The Contemptor's assault cannon opened fire upon the wall, suppressing the Night Lords on it and shredding those who did not seek cover fast enough. With thundering steps, Amarah led the charge towards the gatehouse, his armoured form a bulwark which drew the ire of the fortress's defenders. The Stormbird had carried onwards, passing over the gatehouse as its void shields strained with bright light under the deadly attentions of the bastion's anti-air guns. From this shining glare emerged golden figures. They descended upon the wall and its defenders, Castum landing first, his spear piercing clean through the eyelens of a traitor before his foot touched stone. As the Night Lord's legionary toppled, Castum pulled his spear free, a blow from its shaft pitching a traitor over the wall, then a thrust impaling another legionary, as the Serap's perdition weapon blazed into life, consuming its target in flame. The other Seraphs landed around their leader as the Night Lords atop the wall section drew chainsword and blade. A knot of gold amongst the ranks of midnight blue, the Sanguinary Guard carved a bloody path along the gatehouse walls as he struck down the Night Lords, casting the bodies of traitors from the walls with precise blows from their swords and axes. Angels' tears landed with them, unleashing bolts of Volkite fire upon the Night Lords in the courtyard below. driving them back from their defensive positions around the gatehouse. The Stormbird carried onwards, over pressure from its failing shields shattering windows from courtyard buildings. Its final act was one of sacrifice. A volley of missiles and las cannon bursts, spearing into an array of communication towers hidden in the shadows of the keep, silencing the Vox interference. Baleyed voices and orders replacing the Nostraman chants. Its cargo delivered and duty done, the Stormbird attempted to peel off, but its shields were dead, its hull rent and engines ablaze. Flak fire chased it and tore through layered armor, and the Stormbird plunged downwards, ploughing a furrow amongst the stonework of the courtyard. The efforts of the Sanguinary Guard had drawn away the focus of Krone's forces, and at the gate, Amarah slammed into the metal doors, tearing them from their mountings. Momentum carried the dreadnought forwards, Amarah's armoured bulk ploughing into the Night Lords, exchanging fire with the Angel's Tears atop the wall. Traitors were pulped by Amarah's sweeping fist, and gunned down by the bolters of Krone's warriors that followed the dreadnought through the gate. The few Night Lords that remained gave flight, a fighting retreat, firing bolters at the Blood Angels as the traitors sought the safety of the courtyard's buildings. Krone forbade pursuit, marshalling the warriors by his side to secure the gatehouse against counterattack until reinforced by the reserves that had landed at the base of the causeway. The keep assault. The Blood Angels assembled in the shadow of the gatehouse as the remaining strength of Krone's force made its way into the courtyard of Castum Velx. Nearly half of Krone's strike force had already been wounded or slain in their assault, and so the Judicia disbanded the most afflicted of squads, reconstituting them with reserve elements. Atop the gatehouse wall, Cassiel stood silent, watching legionaries with pitted armor and blooded wounds mustering alongside the unmarred red and gold of their brothers, his Ceres scanning the courtyard for signs of a counterattack that did not come. With no foe in sight, Krone ordered his warriors to encircle the keep that stood at the courtyard's center, a grand bastion in which aspirants of the Ultramarines had once been trained. Only when Krone had mobilized his forces before the bastion's grand entrance did the Sanguinary Guard move to join his assault force, descending from the wall to stand amongst the ranks of the Blood Angels arrayed before the doors. The metal entrance towered over the legionaries, the doors twice their size and engraved with images depicting the Emperor's coming to Macragge, a glorious relief marred by the flayed corpses that hung on chains above it. Breachers locked shields before the entrance, Krone standing with them as Amarah strode forwards, his fist hammering into the plasteel door. Metal buckled, and the dreadnought pulled his arm backwards for a second blow before it could land. Stone and fire engulfed the dreadnought as explosions tore through the door structure. The dreadnought's arm was ripped from its shoulder, its armored form buried to the waist in rubble, and the barrels of the Contemptor's assault cannon bent and broken. Those Blood Angels closest to the door were pulverized by the shockwave, and Krone was thrown from his feet, protected only by the field of his iron halo. Shrapnel or rubble scythed into the ranks of the Blood Angels arrayed further from the door, breaking bones and tossing legionaries aside. Stone dust filled the air as Blood Angel line officers shouted orders to reform as, from beyond the obscuring threshold, bolter and plasma fire was unleashed, killing legionaries as they moved to push towards the now broken doors, forcing the survivors to scatter in search of cover. The Blood Angels unleashed volleys back into the haze, firing upon the vague outline of foes displayed by helmet targeters, few registering hits, and none of the outlines falling. In small numbers, legionaries pushed forwards, only to be pinned down in the rubble-strewn courtyard by the volleys directed against them. Blood-soaked masonry and the corpses of their brothers, the only cover afforded to them. Atop the threshold's rubble itself, scant meters from his warriors, Krone pushed himself to his knees, his helmet shattered, and his shard axe lost beneath the ruins of the door. Stray fire impacted his armor, but none targeted him directly. Hands reached for him instead, grasping his legs, then dragging him into the keep. Each of Krone's assailants was clad in piecemeal armor, the cobalt blue of the ultramarines. Yet though they wore the panoply of a legionary and matched them in size and strength, their majesty was far diminished. All were helmetless and bore scars on their flesh, while into their skulls had been driven gilded metal wires shaped into the Nostraman sigil for Thrall, inductii of the Night Lords, broken souls fashioned into blunt instruments. The inductii dragged the Judicia through the gunfire, and where one was hit, they showed little sign of pain, their eyes holding only a dead gaze that spoke of great woe and shattered minds. Crone kicked out in an attempt to free himself, but more of the hunched legionaries fell upon him, the pack dragging the Judicia towards the traitor line. As the Judicia disappeared from his view, Cassiel took flight, plunging blindly into the fading haze, and though no order was given, his Sereth followed him into the maw of the enemy domain. The gold warriors burst into the grand hall beyond, the once welcoming chamber of marble pillars and finely wrought tiled floors, now occupied by barricades of stone and ceramite. Their arc of flight carried them over the first line of defences and into the midst of the Night Lord's ranks. Their armour-deflecting shots turned against them, cutting their jump pack's propulsion to land amongst the pack of inductii that had dragged Crone deep within. Bursts from Inferno pistols drove the Night Lords round and back, atomizing both flesh and armour when they struck, while the blade of Seraph Tarvelt bisected the inductii that held Crone down. The Golden Warriors formed a ring around the fallen Judicia as he pulled himself to his feet, 8 warriors standing tall in the room's centre, traitors all around them. Judgment. Surrounded by foes on all sides, Crone and the Sanguinary Guard had but a moment to assess the threat and decide on a course of action. At the threshold, the Blood Angels pushed forwards to secure a beachhead, legionaries with flamers unleashing a wall of fire to push back the traitors behind the barricade and create room for Blood Angels to move in. Closer to the Sereth, groups of Night Lords began withdrawing towards the walls, turning their guns from the door to those in their midst. Deeper in the room, near 200 of the Night Lords' inductii gathered at the foot of a dais, their armour a haphazard mix of colours and marks, all bearing the scars of battles they were no doubt scavenged from. Atop the dais stood a throne, the stone chair flanked by a pair of Terminators, the bulky midnight-clad armour contrasting with a pale-skinned Night Lord's legionary who sat upon the throne. The mark of an apothecary was upon the pauldron of the seated legionary, and ident tags registered him as Lancer High of the 8th Legion, a mocking sneer plastered across his unhelmed face. Cassiel looked to Crone for orders, and the Judicia barked forwards in the Baelite battle cant, the knot of red and gold charged towards the throne. A pair of Sereths moved right and another left, each set charging a group of Night Lords to buy time for their brothers to make for the throne. Their movements lent speed by jump pack bursts. The Sereths closed with the Night Lords before the traitors could scarcely open fire. Perdition weapons alight, each pair of Sereths fought shoulder to shoulder, the superior artifice of their blades carving through traitor armour and hewing limbs, their own golden panoply near proof against the blows of chainswords and serrated knives. Yet it was 4 against 24, and soon the Sereths were encircled by foes that struck from every angle, falling into defensive patterns as they sought now to survive and hold the ground. The first Sereth fell to a chain-glaive punched through his side, the second to a spray of point-blank bolter fire that cracked upon his damaged helmet. Then the centre of the Night Lord's line, mere paces from the dueling Sereths, bowed, then broke open. Volkite fire burned flesh from bone as the Angel's tears pushed through the gap, and the Sereths were free. The 2 left standing, charging into the mass of Night Lords to hold the breach in the traitor line open. Blood Angels followed the path carved by the Angel's tears, stowing bolt guns and drawing chainswords in a single practiced movement. The roar of motors joined the cacophony of battle that echoed around the hall. As the Blood Angels swarmed over the Night Lord's barricades, Cassiel and his remaining Sereths, Tervelt and Sanalfon, charged the throne, their jump packs lending them momentum to crash into the mob of inductii with bone-breaking force. The wounded but vengeful crone paused only to retrieve a weapon before he too charged, the four becoming a ruthless storm of blades, axe and spear as they cut their way through the poorly armoured Inductii. Each blow found a gap in their piecemeal armour, and though the Inductii fought with the vigour of frenzied animals, they could lay no killing blows. Numbers were the sole advantage the Inductii held, surrounding the Blood Angels as they forged their way to the throne, the apothecary upon it and the Terminators by his side. The advance slowed as the chain swords of the Inductii rained down blow after blow upon the Ceres, too many for even the most skilled swordsman to turn aside. The armour of their sanguinary guard became dented and battered, the gold all but hidden beneath the blood of their foes. For all their numbers, they proved ill-matched against the greater skill of the Ceres. 10 paces from the throne, the mob of Inductii had been broken, a dozen still standing, and the eviscerated remains of the rest carpeting the floor behind the Blood Angels. The few that remained wavered, then broke, scattering towards the rear of the hall as they fled the Ceres' wrath. Atop the throne, the Hansahai had observed the battle with a furrowed brow and the scrutiny of a vivisector dissecting a specimen. As more of his Inductii had fallen, he had motioned for the Night Lords at his side to follow him, as he stood and turned away from the battling seraphs, walking with a mocking lack of haste to the rear of the room. As Inductii sprinted past him, he gestured again, and his Terminators turned to meet the seraphs head-on, while the Hansahai continued walking. Sanalphon was the first to reach the Night Lords, slamming his inferno-wreathed axe deep into the layered armour of a Terminator's shoulder. In response, the Night Lord's warrior's clawed hand lashed out and punched through the seraph's torso. While the second of the Night Lords gave battle to Crone and Tyrvelt, Cassiel met his brother's killer, spear raised. It darted out in a flurry of blows. 3 were turned aside by his target's bulky armour, while the 4th bit deep into the broken pauldron, the stench of burning flesh rising as the spear's fire spread into the traitor's wound. The claw of his foe sought the seraph's blood, but Cassiel pivoted backwards. Movement had caught his eye, as at the rear of the room, the Hansahai was within arm's length of the door. In a single fluid motion, Cassiel hefted his spear and hurled it towards the Hansahai. The flaming weapon cut through the air, arcing over the Terminator's shoulder to slam into the apothecary's chest, punching through armor, bone and flesh to impale the traitor into the stone wall behind him. Flame blackened the Hansahai's armor as he struggled in vain to rip the spear free, but Cassiel could spare no more thought as a lightning claw cut into his side, sending the Seraph sprawling to the floor. The Night Lord's Terminator moved to deliver a killing blow, only for a flaming axe to cut through his armored helm. The fallen weapon of Sanalphon, wielded by Crone, the Judicious' own foe, already lying dead. Cassiel moved to stand, only to be thrown from his feet again as explosions tore through the room. Above, the ceiling began to crumble, and a deluge of rubble rained down upon the grand hall. The throne dais and the area around it were quickly buried beneath rock, with Crone and the Seraphs barely escaping the avalanche of stone. Towards the threshold, Blood Angels and Night Lords alike dove to avoid the mass of falling masonry, pulling back from battle to avoid being crushed. Though the Blood Angels sought to re-engage their foe, the bulk of the Night Lords had already begun to retreat, leaving behind those too wounded to move. The traitors withdrew into corridors that branched off from the hall, where the Blood Angels sought to follow. Explosions tore through the corridors, killing traitor and loyalist alike, as the Night Lords attempted to seal the corridors behind them, no matter the cost. Those left behind were hacked apart by the chainswords of the Blood Angels, with no mercy offered to the traitors. A duty done. In the aftermath of battle, Crone regrouped his warriors, sending strike teams to the catacombs below in search of the bio-vaults they had been dispatched to secure. Some lay open, their gene locks broken and the contents plundered, but most remained untouched. Preloaded encryption engrams unwound the seals, and Blood Angel's apothecaries secured the progenoids for transport to orbit. With his task completed, albeit at the cost of a dreadful butcher's bill, Crone ordered his forces to withdraw from Telazar, passing word to the auxiliary cohort still fighting in Velx City to disengage. The sole delay was afforded to Cassiel's wish to dig through the rubble in the throne room. In doing so, they discovered no trace of Lansahai or the spear which had impaled him. Crone refused any notion of pursuit or further delay. Other forces would come to secure Talasar, and to them would fall the task of hunting the traitors that remained. Sanguinius had ordered the gene stock secured and returned to Macragge, not a campaign of conquest and occupation, and so Crone would obey. They left behind a lawless Talasar, the Night Lord's hold upon it broken, but no loyalists' presence to replace them. Months would pass before new fleets would arrive to restore order, yet the canker of the Night Lord's presence had largely been excised, and few of their number left standing. The balance of power in the realm of Ultramar had shifted, albeit incrementally, in the Loyalists' favor. Tempus Pergatus. The Adeptus Mechanicus come under attack from a Xenos foe. Part 1. The Magos. Magos Technicus, Tathic Sean, hesitated. Despite the urgency of the situation, her need to act was overridden by an uneasy blurt of contradictory data from her internal augmetics. She paused in an open hatchway, gripping its frame with one metal hand to steady herself. Her Skitarii halted with her, a few glancing at one another, crimson optics fizzing with unease in the gloom of the poorly lit corridor. Distant screams carried to them from some lower deck, flesh voices and binaric wails entwined. The portions of Magos Sean's face that were organic twisted in consternation as data spooled through her cortex, insisting she had suffered a terrible wound when all evidence was to the contrary. Plasma membrane sheaths necessitated across her visual lenses as she isolated and purged the erroneous data. She examined and then impatiently excised several more data artifacts, a corrupted timestamp, impossible energy readings, and a secondary cortical alarum. I have no time for such nonsense, she thought, and goaded herself into motion. The lumens studding the corridors of the explorator bark, Savant, were flickering as though the ship's machine spirit were distressed. Smoke drifted in thin runnels along the ceilings, flowing from somewhere deeper where violence had doubtless been done. Yet Magos Shan did not fear harm at the hands of the Xenos that had boarded her vessel. Rather, she felt the need to punish them for their presumption in setting foot upon this blessed bark of the Omnissiah. If she feared anything as much as so heavily augmented a being as she still experienced based human emotions, it was the risk that the alien boarding party might imperil the device. That was why she made haste through the passages and chambers of the Savant, accompanied by her Skitarii clades and hulking Castellan robots, to reach the vault that contained the device and ensure it was secured against hostile alien threats. And then, she thought with fierce satisfaction, to unleash its sacred might upon the Xenos filth. Magos Sean had brought the device all the way from the deep vaults of her forge world. Styges 8 harbored many such ancient treasures of the Omnissiah, and, though perhaps she should have sought more explicit permission from her superiors before liberating this one, Sean was certain that the machine god would not begrudge her the use of one in so holy a crusade as this. To strike at the heart of the pariah nexus, to comprehend the twisted uses the deviant Xenos had found for precious Noctilith, and to reclaim that vital substance for the use of the Omnissiah servants. Such was surely holy work. It was also, as this present situation demonstrated all too neatly, perilous. Hence, Magos Sean's choice to liberate the device in its auto-reliquary and bring it with her in secret. She did not doubt that such a gift of the Omnissiah would prove its worth when unleashed upon the heretical androids that had boarded Savant. She just needed to reach it and unshackle it from its bonds first. The Skitarii vanguard of clade Omega Primus Rho led the advance. They tramped along corridors of brass and brushed steel, and clattered down spiraling iron stairways. Their radium carbines swept every hatchway and shadow. Their optic lenses burned with purpose in their ironclad helms. Such loyal protectors would allow nothing to harm their mistress, Sean knew. For all that, she was glad of Clade's Omega Secundus Rho and Omega Tertius Thetis, stiffening her force's numbers, and for the trio of massive castellans that surrounded her protectively while their datasmith, Hein, scurried in their wake. Reaching the bottom of another stairwell, the Skitarii of Omega Primus Rho recorded themselves smoothly, preparing to push through the heavy cog-shaped bulkhead door before them. This portal, Sean knew, led onto the deck where the device languished in its vault. She also knew, thanks to the constant inload stream of her advanced augmetics, that Xenos contacts were reported approaching the vault from the opposite direction. Time is our enemy here, she thought. Binaric hymnals rang out as the Skitarii Vanguard Alpha of Omega Primus Rho completed his interference abasement with the bulkhead door's machine spirit. "Clear to advance, Magos," he blurted to her. "Dispensation Skitarii Alpha 118 Rho," she replied in binaric cant. "Serve with alacrity and offer the mercy of the machine." She received a fierce blurt of acquiescence. It was a popular sentiment within the Skitarii of Styges 8, the mercy of the machine. Sean supposed it constituted a form of humour. Machines, after all, performed their function without compunction. There was no mercy to be found within their relentless iron hearts. The bulkhead door cycled open amidst the tolling of brass bells and fanfare screeching binaric choristry from cherubic servitors wired into alcoves above the doorway. The carmine strobe of emergency lumens split through, limning Omega Primus Rho for an instant as though drenching them in gore. Then they advanced, guns up, and the rest of Magos Sean's force followed them through. The Magos sensed at once that something was awry in this portion of the ship. The Savant had been part of a small Adeptus Mechanicus flotilla, attempting to travel from the Martika system to reinforce the Imperial defenders at Vertigus. The deleterious effects of the Nephilim anomaly had turned their journey into a grueling trial, as the vessels had dropped unexpectedly out of the warp time and again, suffering more attritional damage each time. Yet the empiric disjunction that had hurled Savant out of the warp had been an order of magnitude more violent and damaging than anything else the flotilla had experienced. It was why their sister ships had been forced to abandon them in their race to reach the Vertigus system, and why Magos Sean had become acclimatized to seeing damage wrought throughout the ship's corridors. All she had done for the past 5 Tempus Indomitus standard days was work at repairing that damage. There was something else at work on this deck, however. Sean saw the depressingly familiar buckled deck plates and burst conduits caused by the emergency translation from the warp. Yet she also noted tendrils of what appeared to be corrosion, furring consoles and stanchions. She vid-captured images of the corruption using secondary optics as she swept down the corridor, and upon analyzing the playbacks through one of her 3 backup cortices, was surprised to see that the rust was visibly spreading. Part of her consciousness watched with growing disquiet as fingers of corroding corruption spider-webbed across a console, extinguishing indicator bulbs one by one. Each delicate glass oblong flickered crimson, then turned black as it was touched, glass cracking with sharp little clinks. Magos Sean reached out with her Omnissiah-given senses, her disquiet growing as she tasted unnatural energies at work within the fabric of the ship. Whatever was happening, it involved mysteries of the Omnissiah that lay outside her own areas of study. Yet she could sense its effects well enough. The visual corruption was only one aspect of a creeping entropy that burned out bundled wires and corroded data matrices deep within Savant systems. Yet, laced amongst these deleterious effects, were stranger anomalies still. Sean's flesh face twitched again as her data senses touched upon a conduit amidst the damaged sections that instead seemed in perfect working condition. She interrogated its monitoring spirit with a thought and frowned more deeply at the unexpected answers it provided. It was impossible that this data conduit could have been installed this very day, fresh from the forges of Styges 8, yet all indicators asserted that such was the case. Sean was dragged away from investigating the anomaly further by the sudden fierce clamour of gunfire from up ahead. With a binaric curse, she refocused her primary attention upon her surroundings. 170 feet further along the corridor, Magos Sean's internal auspex detected xenoform energy signatures. The strobe-lit murk of the corridor curdled further there as flashes of emerald light silhouetted the Skitarii of Omega Primus Rho, who stood in close firing ranks and laid down a hail of radium rounds at the approaching aliens. One of Sean's devoted warriors was blasted from his feet, layers of metal and flesh billowing away from his body under the flaying energies of his killer's gun. Through the gap left by the fallen soldier, Magos Sean got her first look at the android Xenos advancing down the corridor. Killing light glinted in the artificial eyes of the Necrons, the ghoulish machine creatures shambling closer by the moment, their guns spitting beams of vivid green energy into the exposed Skitarii. Omega Primus Rho closed ranks, and the enemy was lost to Magos Sean's sight again. Her followers were suffering, she knew, yet their sacrifice would be worthwhile. They had pushed far enough along the corridor before engaging the foe. Just 55 feet ahead of her, the Magos saw the armored door of the vault set into the corridor wall, sending a swift blurt to her followers and commanding them to protect her at all costs. The Magos deployed her mechadendrites in a writhing halo, and all but fell upon the access panel. "Enemy numbers increasing, Magos," blurted Skitarii Alpha 118 Rho to her as she worked. "Acknowledgement," she sent back distractedly. The vault had been sealed with thrice-sanctified data cords and would not be opened swiftly. "Enemy numbers increasing, Magos," blurted Skitarii Alpha 118 Rho to her once again. "Repetition is unnecessary," she sent back. Tagging irritation against her tonal indicators, she received a query response. "Contrition. Request clarity, Magos. What repetition?" Increasingly annoyed by the unwanted distraction at such a crucial moment, Magos Sean went to sample the Skitarii Alpha's repeated query and exploded it to him by way of a response. She paused when she realized that, according to her conversational chronologue, he had indeed only blurted once. Impossible, she thought, experiencing an unpleasant moment of déjà vu. As with the previous anomalous readings, Sean dismissed and purged them. She would not risk anomalous data corrupting her cortices. Yet, even as she bent back to her labors, Magos Sean harbored a swiftly cohering theory. "The Necrons have unleashed some techno-heretical weapon upon my ship," she thought, the idea causing her to suffer a digital churn equivalent to nausea. "There is temporal distortion here, and it is not natural." The thought only made her work quicker. At last, the vault's huge doors groaned open. Frozen vapor spilt out, dissipating to reveal the dark space beyond. Sat in a pool of frosty light was an ornate auto-relinquery larger than an onager dune crawler. Within it, Sean knew, the device slumbered. As the sounds of battle intensified, she swept into the vault, mechadendrites coiling with anticipation. She would release the machine from its bondage, ally it to her will. Then she would make the Necrons pay for setting foot upon her vessel. "In the Omnissiah's name," blurted Magos Sean as she set to work. Part 2. The Cryptech. A prize worthy of a chronomancer awaits, but time is not on his side. Castum the Silent stood in a cavernous space within the human's crude warship. The last corposcent energies of dimensional translocation danced across his finely wrought living metal form. Scattered around the chronomancer's feet were the scorched bodies of vermin as defenders, slain by the energistic magnificence of Castum's arrival. Nor had he come to this ship alone. A sizable retinue had accompanied the chronomancer through the dimensional veils and were now arrayed around him in protective combat boarding formation. Bulky immortals armed with crackling Tesla carbines, ghostly canoptic wraiths, their talons twitching with anticipation to kill. A squad of sinister deathmarks, ranks of vacant-eyed warriors ready to do his bidding. All had been liberated from amongst the legions of Casmatef's lord and master, Nektoshar the Immeasurable. They were but a drop in that particular ocean, and Casmatef judged a paltry enough force by Nektoshar's standards that their absence would not be missed. After all, Casmatef had done all the work to prepare for his raid. He would not see the prize and the glory stolen by the aristocratic dullard in whose ship he laboured. Though its flesh and blood occupants had been slain, the chamber still harboured life. It was lined with rows of huge glass and metal vats that looked, to Casmatef's eye, typical of crude human artifice. Within each, enormous algal blooms stirred midst sluggish, fluid currents. The chronomancer judged their purpose to be oxygen production, to sustain the flimsy organic forms of the crew. He noted, however, that the algae behaved strangely. One by one, the blooms were turning black as though decomposing at an accelerated rate. As each crumbled and drifted as sludge to the bottom of its tank, so then it grew again, with unnatural vigour, until its soupy matter filled its vats from top to bottom. The dying off would then begin again, in a seemingly endless loop. Casmatef considered it a point of professional pride that he could recognize temporal distortion at work, yet this was nothing of his doing. "Curious," he vocalized, tapping his fingertips against the grip of his Aeon stave. His immortals looked in his direction, then determined that his utterance had not been a battlefield order. They returned their incurious eyes to scanning for threats. Casmatef ran a swift spatial location check, determining that his advanced guard of warriors had pushed up through the decks of the human ship and cleared a path towards his prize. They had eliminated scattered resistance from gun-tooting cyborg primitives, but were only now running into more serious organized foes. It was time for Casmatef to involve himself personally, he thought. His energy reserves had all but recovered from the exertion of translocation. The effort of masterminding this attack had been considerable, but Casmatef flattered himself that such endeavors were well within his remarkable abilities. First, he had used esoteric dimensional energy scanners of his own design to stretch his awareness out into the embattled systems of the contra-immaterium nodal matrix. As he had hoped, it had not taken him long to locate this signature trace of something powerful, a technology these simplistic primates could barely comprehend, let alone claim true ownership of. With that done, Casmatef had had his Deathmark hirelings observe the chosen prey from the vantage of a quasi-entangled pocket dimension. Once the chronomancer was certain of his prey's location, their destination and their weakness, he turned to another device he had fashioned during his studies. Though it burned itself out in the process, his Noctilith-infused chronographic beamer, and then on to rake the prey's crude immaterial engines. The result had been, to Casmatef's mind, extremely satisfactory. The human vessel had been chronopolarized against the linear temporal flow, even as the anti-immaterial energies of the weapon had forced the ship violently out of the infinite dimension beyond. The effect had been to tortuously extend the ship's process of translation from one dimensional state to another on an atomic level, overloading the engines intended to effect such translation and cause considerable structural damage throughout the craft. In short, it had been crippled, but its precious contents had been left unharmed by the finesse of Casmatef's weapon. It had been inevitable that the human's stunted sense of biological urgency would see the other ships in the flotilla rush on towards their destination, leaving his prey isolated. After one swift use of Overlord Nektoshar's long-range translocation matrices, Casmatef and his borrowed forces had been aboard. Now, as he strode over the ruined corpses of his primate foes, Casmatef was determined to claim his prize swiftly and ruthlessly. The entire vessel was his for the taking, of course, but it was the technological marvel at the ship's heart he really wanted. The chronomancer pulsed a protocol imperative to his retinue that set them in motion also. As they advanced, Castum allowed agitated chronoparticles to stream from his ionosphere, the better to speed his soldiers on their way relative to localized space-time. The canoptic rays drifted straight up, phasing silently through the chamber's high ceiling and into the maze of decks above. The rest of the Necrons moved out in slightly ragged footstep. Their living metal feet cracked human bones and buckled crude metal bionics as they went. What primitive beings could ever stand against such eternal magnificence? He mused out loud, ignoring a second questioning look from his immortals. Castum focused instead upon the simplistic thought pulses coming back from his advanced guard of warriors. They had located the primary prize, it seemed. Castum was unsurprised at their warning of increased human defensive strength coalescing on their location. "Let the vermin scrabble and bite," he said aloud, enjoying the metallic resonance of his voice. "We must permit them at least this instinctive expression of defiance before we eradicate them. To do less would be uncivilized." Further self-aggrandizing ruminations were choked off, however, as a shock wave of esoteric radiation rolled through the fabric of reality. Castum's refined ocular perceptions allowed him to see the intricate web of energy spiraling through the structure of the ship, exciting molecules in strange ways. In some places, their arrangement twisted, extrusions of heated metal bursting from deck plates and walls like bone spurs. In others, small explosions blossomed as the molecular excitations became too great. Sudden urgency gripped Castum, and his good humor evaporated. It had never even occurred to him that the primates might actually understand how to use the device they harbored, let alone that their primitive urges would lead them to unleash its powers in a weaponized form. He was disturbed by the score of overlapping, stuttering alarm pulses that came back to him from his advanced party, looping and repeating in counter-temporal contradiction until one by one they died away. Whatever the human technology was, Castum thought, it was evidently more powerful than even he had initially thought. Worse, its effects appeared to be entangling themselves on an energistic level with the leftover chrono-immaterial radiation that had saturated the vessel after his weapon had smashed it back into reality. The notion that he might have overreached was as alien to Castum as concepts like physical hunger or mental tiredness. He had been freed from all such shackles by biotransference long eons before, yet even he had to admit to a certain amount of trepidation. Pulsing commands at his retinue to advance more swiftly and cut down any who opposed them without mercy or consideration of the triarchal codes. The cosmic science practiced by the Necron cryptex was so advanced that they seemed sorcerous to the galaxy's youngest species, and to Castum's mind, they were pursued with perfect intellectual rigor. Yet, just as a crude flesh-and-blood creature might shatter a delicate machine that was far beyond its understanding by striking it with a rock, so, conceivably, could the primitive tech shamans on this ship destabilize Castum's own endeavors by recklessly unleashing technologies they did not understand. The chronomancer thought again of the algal blooms growing and dying in an endless loop, and urged even more speed from his followers. Somewhere ahead, Gorth's weaponry discharged with sounds like ripping cloth, accompanied by the crackle and snap of his immortal's Tesla carbines. Castum barely noticed the human life signs winking out in his extended perception matrix. His thoughts were firmly fixed on his prize. He would blast a path through his enemy's simplistic defenses, overwhelm them with the magnificent military might of the Necron dynasties, and relieve them of their technological wonder. More importantly, he would do this before they succeeded in releasing its true potential in a way that might actually endanger his continued existence. "Such primitive creatures cannot be trusted with technology of this sort," he told his disinterested followers, uncaring that they had not the mental faculties to comprehend his meaning. "It is for their own good that I take this wonder of artifice from them, after all," he finished, enjoying a moment of cruel amusement. The poor things might hurt themselves with it. Part 3. The Moment. The tech adversaries realize that time is not on their side. Gunfire, energy weapon discharge, and binaric shouts of pain echoed throughout the savant. Magos Shon could feel the vibrations tormenting the venerable ship's structure even as she strode along its corridors. Around her, the remainder of her forces advanced, bloodied but unbowed after their gunfight with the invading Necrons. Shon was analyzing the Xenos advance, enloading auger data and binaric exchanges from the ship's noosphere, as smaller bands of Skitarii and weapon servitors encountered the aliens. There could be no doubt that, thus far, nobody aboard Savant had been able to offer the Necrons a serious challenge, barring her own successful capture of the vault. Yet Magos Shon still felt confident. Firstly, she was certain now to within acceptable tolerances that the Xenos were the source of the increasing temporal anomalies and supernatural phenomena plaguing the ship. This was good. It made it easier for her to ignore the ghostly echoes of Skitarii she had seen slain mere moments earlier, still marching alongside their living compatriots. They were mere products of tech heresy, soon to be purged by the light and logic of the Omnissiah. Secondly, Magos Technicus, Tasik Shon, was certain that she could defeat the foe, for she was now master of the device. Shon glanced back at the enormous, deformed servitor that lumbered at her heels. The creature was forced to bend almost double to negotiate the ship's corridors. Its over-muscled bulk was thrice that of the castellans that moved in its shadow. Obviously vat-grown for the purpose of hosting the device, the servitor was headless and milk-pale, save where its flesh had been blackened by the frostbite of extended cryo-slumber. The myriad tubes, fiber bundles, and metallic extrusions of the device threaded themselves in and out of its frame, connecting the bulbous armor-glass tanks that rose like enormous blisters all over the servitor's body. With each, Shon could see the filtered vitae of the servitor mingling with a quicksilver-like liquid that swirled in invisible currents. Blue-white lightning danced through those armored tanks, energies that had been unleashed at Shon's binaric urging to completely eradicate Omega Primus Rho and the mass of Necrons that had been about to overwhelm them. Shon was confident that the martyrdoms of her faithful Skitarii would earn them a place in the Omnissiah's eternal mechanisms. Meanwhile, she hoped fervently that the aliens that they had fought now suffered the worst torments the machine god could contrive. For her part, Shon concerned herself with the Xenos androids still infesting Savant. Stepping through another high hatchway, the Magos emerged into Maintenance Shrine Ajaxid Tertius. This would be her battleground. Let the Necrons meet her here, she thought. All data indicated that they would arrive at this point within minutes, staunchly ignoring the fact that her internal chronologues were spiraling backwards and forwards, seemingly at random, and that the bulky machines of the Maintenance Shrine furred over with swift-spreading rust before gleaming with apparent newness. Shon deployed her remaining forces. "In the Omnissiah's name, we will halt them here," she blurted. She received determined responses from all of her followers. She chose to ignore, also, that several of them came from warriors already slain. One deck below Shon's position, and hastening up a broad set of steel steps, Chronomancer Castum the Silent adjusted his grip on his Eon Staff and sent final protocol pulses to his retinue. To his annoyance, his canopted wraiths had become embroiled in holding back human soldiers advancing through an adjoining partition of the ship, and then been trapped in a bubble of recursive time that showed no sign of abating. The rest of his forces were moving into position, however. Soon enough, they would prove their inevitable superiority. Kasmatev was becoming extremely uncomfortable with the rate at which the temporal anomalies were spreading throughout the ship. He considered that he might have been somewhat arrogant when he had assumed he would not require an escape plan. Casting his perceptions beyond the physical shell of the human vessel, Kasmatev watched chronoparticulate streams trailing back through space-time from the moment of the enforced translation event. Streamers of immaterial contra-causality braided themselves through the energetic streams, warping their effects in unpredictable ways. It looked to Castum as though they were weaving themselves around the ship like an invisible cocoon, one he had no desire to be sealed inside. He dared not risk the humans triggering their device again. "I must end their ignorant fumbling before they bring us to disaster," he muttered, then sent an annoyed override pulse to fix the heads of his immortals forward before they could glance a question at him yet again. A moment later, the elite android soldiers had more than enough to occupy their combat-centric personality engrams. Advancing through another hatchway, the Necrons found themselves subject to a hail of fire from the other side of a broad chamber dotted with bulky agglomerations of machinery. Several warriors were punched off their feet by the impact of radiation-soaked rounds, while a plasma beam erased an immortal from the waist up. Castum, who had known the barrage would be incoming, ducked swiftly behind one of the humans' crude machine banks. It had to look to the enemy as though they had caught his warriors by surprise. That way, or so the chronomancer hoped, the primitives would be so caught up in the excitement of blasting his foot soldiers apart that they would not turn their attentions to a shadowy gantry up near the chamber's ceiling. Up there he could see his death mark stepping from a pocket dimension. They would put down the human tech shaman, thus preventing the creature from triggering the device again. Once that threat was neutralized, the rest of the foe could be exterminated at leisure, while Castum applied his immense intellect to carefully defusing the temporal time bomb his idiotic foes had created. Megatron watched the Xenos march like mindless automata into the gunfire of her followers and offered binaric praise to the Omnissiah. Of course, such degenerate alien machines would prove clumsy and easily defeated when confronted by the might of the machine god's servants, she thought. True, some of her Scitarii rounds passed through the air with impossible slowness, becoming ever more sluggish until they hung frozen, and that was unsettling. But the rest of their firepower hit home with pleasing force. Necrons toppled with chunks of their crania blasted away, limbs torn off or bodies melted by radiation and energy blasts. Her Castellan robots plowed through their foes' midst, Datasmith hing, huddling in their shadows as their huge fists pulverized alien androids. Energy blasts flashed back in response from the aliens' guns, reducing more and more Scitarii to ruined corpses and even toppling one of the Castellans. Yet it was clear the fight was going Sean's way. "It is time," she blurted, turning to the device. "In the Omnissiah's name, I beseech thee, unleash again thine scourging might, and put an end to these deviant Xenos." Lurking behind the ugly bulk of the machine bank, Castum sensed to his horror what the tech shaman was about to do. He pulsed a query to his death marks, but the response was unnaturally sluggish. They would not fire in time. Setting aside his anger at the way his retinue was so singularly failing to defeat this unsophisticated foe, he realized that he must risk one tightly contained temporal manipulation if his plan was to succeed. It was a calculated risk. One of Castum's wisdom and skill would surely be able to carry it off without triggering disaster, he told himself. Resolved, he stepped from cover and leveled his Eon stave at the tech shaman and the grotesque hulk of meat and machinery looming above her. Silver-blue lightning was sparkling into life across its body, and Castum saw braids of chrono-immaterial energy rising their way in through the hull of the ship, questing towards the source of the esoteric energies. "This cannot happen," he snarled. "I will not allow it." In his peripheral senses, Castum saw the energy flares as the death marks fired at last. Invisible to the naked eye, the beams of their synaptic disintegrators reached out to transfix the enemy tech shaman. In the same instant, Castum unleashed the power of weaponized time, aiming it to wither the biological frame hosting his prize, and thus prevent it from discharging the device. The rising tendril of chrono-immaterial energy that stabbed inward from the void at that moment seemed, to Castum, as though it were driven by some malevolent sentience. It fouled his intervention, entwining itself with the energies he had unleashed before reacting with unexpected volatility to his temporal bolt. Castum the Silent appreciated, in that last instant before disaster, that there was a certain elegant irony in the fact that he, a self-proclaimed master of the chronomantic arts, could not have timed his intervention worse. The untrammelled energies of time, immaterium, and weaponized radiation entangled with one another in ways even the chronomancer had never believed possible. As a human tech shaman collapsed boneless with blood and oil spewing from her ruptured optics, her fall slowed and then halted altogether. A coruscating torrent of energy roared out of the convulsing flesh hulk at her side, racing back along the temporal beam of Castum's aeon stave, before striking the device and detonating it in a time-warping eruption. Layered ghostly after-images blossomed from every surface and living being, and began to flow back upon themselves. It was the last thing Castum the Silent saw, before the chrono loop trapped them all within its embrace, and not, he realized despairingly, for the first time. Magos Technicus, Tathic Sean, hesitated. Despite the urgency of the situation, her need to act was overridden by an uneasy blurt of contradictory data from her internal augmetics. She paused in an open hatchway, gripping its frame with one metal hand to steady herself. Her Skitarii halted with her, a few glancing at one another, crimson optics fizzing with unease in the gloom of the poorly lit corridor. Distant screams carried to them from some lower deck, flesh voices and binaric wails entwined. The portions of Magos Sean's face that were organic twisted in consternation as data spooled through her cortex, insisting she had suffered a terrible wound, when all evidence was to the contrary. Plasma membrane sheaths nicetated across her visual lenses as she isolated and purged the erroneous data. She examined and then impatiently excised several more data artifacts, a corrupted timestamp, impossible energy readings, and a secondary cortical alarum. I have no time for such nonsense, she thought, and goaded herself into motion. The Wolf Brothers. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Space Marine legions were broken down into smaller formations known as chapters, so that no one could ever again hold power over an entire legion. Some of the legions divided many times and spawned many successors, while the Space Wolves divided only once. The sole successor chapter, named the Wolf Brothers, was forged during the second founding. It was the dream of the Primarch Leman Russ that the Wolf Brothers would be the first in a series of chapters drawn from his genetic ancestry, and the Space Wolves, along with their successors, would create a cordon around the Eye of Terror to shield against future attacks from the traitor legions. Tragically, the gene seed of the Wolf Brothers was fatally flawed, leading to the manifestation of large numbers of wolfen and other more terrible abominations within their ranks. Shortly after their creation, the chapter was disbanded by the Ordo Astartes, its stores of gene seed destroyed, and its surviving battle brothers given the choice between a death in glorious battle or a shameful execution. However, before the Ordo Astartes' orders could be fully carried out, much of the chapter disappeared, the Wolf Brothers vanishing into the depths of space. Some within the Adeptus Terra accused Leman Russ of warning the successor chapter, or even aiding their escape, though no proof was ever uncovered. To this day, rumors persist of small bands of Wolf Brothers fighting with renegade chapters, or living as pariahs in the shadow of the Eye of Terror. The War of the Wolf. There are few enemies the Space Wolves loathe more than those who turn against their own kind. Traitors, oathbreakers, and turncoats. When Logan Grimnar learnt that the arch-traitor Abaddon had found one of the lost Wolf Brothers, he assembled the champions of Fenris to deliver the Space Wolves justice. For the Space Wolves, one of their greatest, most closely guarded secrets is the fate of their one and only successor chapter, the Wolf Brothers. Created as part of the second founding, the Wolf Brothers gene seed proved unpredictable and unstable, combining all of the worst aspects of the Canis Helix and the curse of the Wolfen. After the chapter was disbanded, hundreds of Wolf Brothers vanished entirely, taking with them prized gene seed created from the Space Wolves' own stockpiles. In the year 612, Millennium 41, word reached the Great Wolf that one of these lost brothers was found. For millennia, the Space Wolves had been watching over their wayward kin, secretly shielding them from both the wrath of the Imperium and the influences of chaos, though not always with success. So it was to be this time, and the glad news of the Wolf Brothers' discovery was tainted by word that the planet upon which he rested was in the hands of the Black Legion. Worse still, rumor placed the arch-traitor Fabius Bile within the system, and Grimnar knew it could only be the Wolf Brother and his gene seed that Bile sought. Access to the successor chapter's gene seed would enable the traitorous geneticist to create an army of monstrously corrupt, mutated horrors to fight for the forces of chaos. The Great Wolf would be damned before he let this come to pass. Calling his wolf guard to his side, the old wolf ordered his great company gathered. So armed, Grimnar and his most trusted champions and a small fleet of ships set off into a sea of stars to find the brother wolf and slay any who dared stand in their way. The Well of Souls. Keen hunters and able voidfarers, it did not take long for the champions of Fenris to find the planet on which the Wolf Brother was hidden, despite the stench of traitors hanging heavy around the Eye of Terror. Guarded by intelligence collected by his wolf scouts, and following the augur scent left by the Black Legion craft, Grimnar and his wolves came upon the world of Lumerius. A frozen ball of frost and snow, barely warmed by the watery light from its distant blue star, Lumerius was where the Wolf Brother lay, imprisoned in the ice-locked ruin of a shipwreck thousands of years old. From the command bridge of his strike cruiser on the far edges of the system, Grimnar considered the reports of his Wolf Guard and the faint outline of the Styx-class heavy cruiser, Well of Souls, hanging like a dark splinter in the milky eye of Lumerius. Grimnar had chosen a small but elite flotilla of ships for speed and stealth, and lacked the brute strength to take on such a powerful vessel in open combat. Neither could he ignore it, however. In the end, it was his champion, Arjak Rockfist, that came up with a daring plan to take out the enemy vessel, one that brought fierce grins to the faces of the champions, and a thundering din as they beat their fists onto their chest plates in approval. Like shadows racing across the night sky, a salvo of boarding torpedoes silently bore down upon the Well of Souls. The Space Wolves had launched the missiles from the depths of space, letting their engines burn cold until they glided in under inertia alone. Inside the lead torpedo, Grimnar, Arjak, and a dozen Wolf Guard's shield brothers braced for impact. Seconds before they struck home, the Chaos vessel's augur detected them. Enemy crews scrambling to quad laser turrets and crack missile batteries as the void came alive with slashes of light and fire. The Wolf Guard joked over the Vox that they might have to swim the rest of the way, as the armored hulls were rocked by nearby explosions and raking las cannon fire. Grimnar's boarding torpedo had its tip sheared off by a fusillade of turret fire, vaporizing the servitor pilot and sending the craft spinning. It tumbled through the open launch bay doors of the Well of Souls and crashed into the deck with a screech of tortured metal. With a bellowing war cry, Grimnar smashed his way free of the wreck, the first of the champions of Fenris, out into the hold. Tangled in a twisted ruin of gantries, the torpedo had skidded to a halt beneath a Helldrake roost. Dozens of demon engines hanging like monstrous mechanical chiropterans overhead. Black Legion Chaos Marines on the deck below fired bolters one-handed as they scaled ladders to meet their unidentified threat. Moments later, Arjak and the Shield brothers rejoined their lord. The first Black Legion warrior to reach them had his head hacked from his shoulders by the axe Morkai, while the second was torn to bloody ribbons by Grimnar's Stormbolter. Stirred by the sounds of battle, a Helldrake descended from above, sweeping out its wings and snatching up a Wolf-Guard Terminator in its claws. Even as the demonic beast soared off over the launch bay, the veteran smashed it with his hammer, cursing the creature and the warp that had spawned it. The Helldrake let out a metallic screech as it tore the Space Wolf apart in a shower of gore and shattered ceramite, its kin heeding its call and unfurling their wings. Bolt rounds hurtled up from below, blasting ragged holes in the gantry and exploding against the Shield brothers' armor as the traitor Space Marines concentrated their fire on the invaders. In the air above, Helldrakes circled like gargantuan carrion birds, swooping down to snatch up Wolfguard or washing the Space Wolves with flaming death. Arjak Rockfist held the center of the Space Wolves formation, the anvil shield bashing aside the razor jaws and claws of the Helldrakes as they snapped hungrily at the Space Wolves, while Foehammer scored fracturing blows against the creature's warp iron hides. Again and again, his hammer was cast at the demon engines, each time flashing back to his hand in an actinic blaze. With his warriors outnumbered and trapped against the wreckage of insertion, the old wolf had known from the start it would be but a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. Thinking on his feet, Grimnar struck at the supports of the gantry from which enemy reinforcements were arriving. In a shower of sparks, the walkway came free, the screams of twisting metal drowning out the cries of the Helldrakes as it hurtled to the deck below. Guns of Chaos. While Logan Grimnar and his Wolfguard were locked in combat underneath the Helldrake roost, the rest of the champions of Fenris had breached the Well of Souls in their own torpedoes. Raynolf Ironfang and Ingvar Thunderbrow led a pack of Wolfguard Voidclaws, clad in hulking Terminator armor and armed with paired wolf claws. They proved deadly in the close-quarters fighting. Enemy crewmen would try to erect hasty barricades in corridors and void locks, only to crumble before the fury of the Space Wolves. Only when squads of Black Legionaries confronted them did the advance slow. The deafening hammer of bolt gun fire and blinding flash of wolf claw filling the corridors. After each brutal skirmish, Raynolf would make some jest about the quality of their foes, while grinning at Ingvar, and each time Ingvar would shake his head in silence, only once allowing the ghost of a smile to cross his features, when Raynolf hurled a deckhand at one of his erstwhile overlords. Meanwhile, in the depths of the ship, Grimnar fought his way towards his intended target. Reduced to a handful of Shield brothers, the Great Wolf's force smashed its way through the Black Legion defenses with hammer and shield. With arcing hammer blows, the Space Wolves caved in blast doors to clear a path. Finally, the Great Wolf and his packmates emerged into the Chaos Cruiser's gun-loading deck. Vast beyond reckoning, the deck spanned almost the full length of the vessel. Along the outer hull, towering macro cannons, each as large as a hab block, pointed out into the void. On overhead tracks, cranes and hoists transported shells the size of land raiders, while thousands of slaves hauled on chains of black iron under the lashes of their overseers. Grimnar pointed with his axe to where fresh ordnance was being carried up from the ship's magazine below. Here was where they would cripple the Well of Souls and take her out of the fight. The vessel's captain was no fool, however, and between Grimnar and his goal were a dozen Black Legion Terminators, backed by throngs of maddened cultists. Bearing his fangs, Grimnar raised the axe Morkai above his head and charged. As the two sides closed, bolt rounds and autogun fire whipped between them, detonating in clouds of scorched flesh or ricocheting from Terminator plate. Then, with a deafening crash, the two sides met. Against the disciplined elite of the Black Legion and the disorganized rabble of the cultists, the pride of the Space Wolves proved their skill and ferocity. Brutal hammer blows, flashing fangs, and crackling storm shields all took their toll, as space wolves were dragged down with savage snarls on their lips. Though the Black Legion were a dire foe indeed, under the protection of the Shield Brothers, the master of the Space Wolves and his chapter slew them to a man. As Grimnar tore the axe Morkai from the throat of the last Chaos Terminator in a spray of blood, he realized that only he and Arjak remained standing. Bloody but unbowed, the great wolf gave the sign to Arjak, who hurled Foehammer with all his prodigious strength into the critical workings of the macro cannon shell hoist. As the chains broke, a massive shell fell back down into the ship's primary magazine with a deafening detonation. Heart of the Void. Raynolf Ironfang was the first to step onto the Well of Souls bridge, his hulking grey form lumbering through the still smoking remains of the Void Lock. At his side, Ingvar Thunderbrow and a score of other Void Claws thundered across the deck to meet the Chaos forces. As the Space Wolves pressed their assault, Voidheart, favoured of the Despoiler's lieutenants, watched them come. Clad in Baroque black armour, with a helm of twisted horns and the leering face of a demon, Voidheart sat on the vessel's command throne, overseeing his warriors below. From all sides of the huge chamber, Chaos Space Marines marched forward, blades and bolters ready to end the invaders. Raynolf howled his challenge and charged, his brothers close upon his heels. Everywhere the air was filled with the crash of mass-reactive bolter rounds and the screech of ceramite being rent asunder. Eyes fixed on the demon-faced Chaos Lord, Raynolf forged a bloody trail across the deck. His heavy Terminator armor turned the blades and bolt rounds hammering down upon him, while his Frostblade parried blows and flashed out to sink into heretic flesh. By the time Raynolf reached the base of the command throne, his armor was scarred by dozens of blows, and his sword was crimson with blood. Voidheart leveled his demon blade at Raynolf as he descended from the throne, promising him an eternity of torment within the warp. Raynolf's response was blunt, crude, and to the point. Voidheart easily repelled Raynolf's first flurry of attacks, and at once the Wolfguard knew how dangerous an adversary he faced. His foe's demon blade cut darkly through the air around him, black warp flame dancing hypnotically along its edge. Voidheart's hatred of the Space Wolf was almost palpable in its intensity, a feeling Raynolf held in equal measure for the thrice-cursed traitor standing before him. For a span of agonizing minutes, Raynolf tried to breach Voidheart's guard, but the demon's sword seemed to move with a mind of its own, always there to turn his Frostblade. Sparing a second's glance across the bridge, he could see his brothers equally pressed by the massed ranks of the Black Legion, and was forced to accept that there would be no aid against Voidheart. This moment of distraction was what the Chaos Lord had been waiting for, and in an instant, his weapon flicked forward in an attempt to pierce Raynolf's skull. Only the Wolfguard's acute senses saved his life, and he twisted partly out of the way. Even so, the unnatural blade pierced his helm and scored a bloody line across his face, burning away his left eye. Howling in rage and pain, Raynolf bared his fangs and snarled at Voidheart. Deep within Raynolf's mind, the shadow of the wolf stirred to life, and the Space Marine hurled himself at his foe like a wounded thunderwolf, the two exchanging a flurry of blows. However, it was only when an explosion from far below threw the combatants off balance that the tide turned. A momentary opening allowed Raynolf to hack off Voidheart's sword arm at the shoulder. Clutching the ruined, bleeding stump, the Chaos Lord fled the bridge, his crew moving to cover his escape. As another explosion from below rocked the deck, Raynolf heard the crackling Vox message from the Great Wolf ordering them to withdraw. Cursing the escape of Voidheart, Raynolf hurried to obey the command of his Wolf Lord. Supporting their wounded, Raynolf, Ingvar, and the remaining Void Claws enacted a fighting retreat. Down through decks of fire and ruin they battled, clearing the way with the savage fervor of cornered wolves. As the Space Marines reached the aft launch decks of the Well of Souls, the Chaos Craft was already listing dangerously towards loom areas. The damage had been done. Debris raining down all around them, The Wolf Guard fought their way onto the waiting storm wolves as the great wolf led a defense of the extraction point with the surviving champions. Raynolf was the last to step onto the ramp, pausing only to spit contemptuously onto the deck. Fiends of the deep. Wolf scouts had made planetfall on Lumerius, pinpointing the shipwreck where the wolf brother slumbered, frozen in time. Floating in the middle of a vast polar sea, the void ship was more ice and snow than steel, having drifted amongst the iceberg of Lumerius for millennia. In the heart of the wreck, colossal vaults housed countless stasis caskets, and in one of them slept the lost son of Ras. It was in these vast chambers that Fabius Bile and the Black Legion were searching for Abaddon's prize. Outside, the Chaos forces had fortified the tundra around the ship against assault. Trenches and emplacements reaching out to where the frozen island ended and the frigid blue sea began. From high in the atmosphere, Grimnar surveyed the augers of his storm wolf, considering where to strike. His golden eyes noted the dark prow of the vessel pushing up from the center of its icy prison. Like all space wolves, Grimnar was well versed in the ways of the sea and glacial drifts, like the one he now considered. He knew much of the ship was hidden below the waves, and it was here that the champions of Fenris would strike. The Wolf Lord ordered the Storm Wolf's pilot to come in low over the sea. He rapidly formed an image in his mind's eye of the size and shape of the entombed wreck. Just below the surface was an ice shelf with tunnels leading deeper into the wreck. This would be Grimnar's point of attack, and with his brothers he would drop down to the shelf below and walk beneath the frozen sea into the wreck. Covering his landing, Grimnar had ordered thunderstrike formations, combined teleportation and drop pod assaults to target the Chaos defenses. An orbital barrage arced down from the heavens to pummel the traitor's trenches, preparing the way. As huge chunks of snow-covered steel were hurled skyward, the first Space Wolf drop pods crashed down, and Terminators appeared in flashes of light. The cold air was soon filled with the smoking trails of shells and plasma bolts, and red splashes of blood stained the ice. In answer to the carnage, Chaos Space Marines emerged from the wrecked vessel to bolster the defenses. While the maelstrom of mayhem and death raged overhead, Grimnar and his Wolfguard attacked from below. Marching up out of the frigid sea into the huge caves honeycombing the iceberg, hundreds of meters across, the tunnels were part ice, part twisted steel, their upper limits lost in shadow overhead. Near the front of the advance, Arjak suddenly paused, motioning for his shield brothers to still their tongues. As silence descended, the others heard it too, a hissing, grinding wail coming steadily closer. Through the distorted walls of ice, the Wolfguard could now see dark shapes approaching, moving like metal kraken beneath transparent waves. In a blast of crystal shards, a Mauler fiend emerged, its magma cutters searing a hole through the ice and releasing billowing clouds of steam that obscured the Space Wolf's vision. In the close confines of the tunnel, the Wolfguard could do little to avoid these weapons designed to crack open fortifications, and two shield brothers were sliced open by super-hot blasts of energy. Arjak pushed forward, but before he could strike, another one erupted from the ground beneath his feet, grabbing him in its pitted jaws. The Wolfguard rallied around him, their hammers fracturing the steel beast's hide but failing to bring it down. In the blinding mist, Grimnar's nose guided his attacks as he followed the oil and blood stench of the machine. Grimnar let out a battle cry and struck out into the fog, feeling the axe Morkai sink deep into warp-forged iron. Hearing their lord join the fray, the other Wolfguard let out their howls of rage and attacked with even greater fury. Arjak, still trapped within the demon engine's grinding jaws, hurled Foehammer into the mist before thrusting his gauntlet deep into its mouth. In a flash of light, the hammer rematerialized in his fist, smashing apart the monster's head from within. Wolfguard swarmed over the remaining Mauler fiend, a mighty blow from Grimnar finally sending it crashing to the ground with a pained roar. Gathering up the remaining Wolfguard, Grimnar advanced down the tunnels made by the Mauler fiends, following them into the rusting heart of the ship. Tomb of Wolves. Inside the ruined vessel, the space wolves climbed through corridors twisted and torn by centuries beneath the ice. Ancient statues in relief stared forlornly at the wolf guard from under layers of snow. Grimnar recognized some of the tunnels and chambers they pushed their way through, the icons and regalia of the Imperium upon them. Others were alien, strangely asymmetrical shapes and Xenos symbols dominated their walls. This had been an accursed vessel even before it found a resting place upon Lumerius. Countless dark deeds had been wrought here. Of that, Grimnar was sure. The Great Wolf was the first to hear the hum of plasma generators from up ahead, a thread of sound hidden under the muffled thump and rumble of the battle raging overhead. Motioning for his brothers to draw close and draw their weapons, he led the way down into a vast fractured chamber. The room was the broken remains of a stasis vault, where thousands of people would sleep away centuries of interstellar travel. Concentric circles of stasis caskets ringed the vault from floor to ceiling, vanishing up into the dim, ice-locked roof and down into the debris-choked depths below. Precious few of the caskets still thrummed with life, the distorted remains of their occupants barely visible in the shadows. The rest were wreathed in darkness. Several levels below, Grimnar could see the flickering lights of las cutters and the unmistakable form of Fabius Bile's spidery harness as he directed his vassals to carve open one stasis casket after another. The Wolf Lord knew that it would only be a matter of time before the traitor found the Wolf Brother, a tragedy he could not allow to come to pass. Roaring a challenge, Grimnar fired a burst of bolter rounds, though he was far out of range. Even so, it had the desired effect, and Bile turned from his task, his Black Legion bodyguard closing ranks around him. Like a ceramite avalanche, the Wolf Guard descended down the side of the cylindrical vault, crashing down from one level to the next, along rusted gantries and ramps. As they came, the Chaos Space Marines poured bolt of fire into the Wolf Guard, rounds exploding as they tore the chamber apart. Grimnar was the first to reach the traitors, landing on the lower level with a reverberating clang. The first Black Legionaries to charge him met with a bloody fate, their remains tumbling to the floor. In moments, Grimnar was upon Fabius Bile, a brutal axe blow hacking off one of the progenitor's arachnid appendages. Quick as a serpent, Bile counterattacked, wielding a ghastly-looking weapon that crackled with warp energy. Inflicting agonizing pain, the barest touch was enough to bring the Wolf Lord to his knees. His fangs gritted in pain as the weapon's curse raged through him. Before Grimnar could rise, Bile raised a dripping syringe. He had come here for the Wolf Brother, but with the Master of the Space Wolves kneeling at his feet, he could capture an even greater prize. At that moment, Foehammer smashed Bile's pseudo-limb aside, Arjak barreling forwards to place himself between Grimnar and his foe. With the Black Legion now giving ground before the ferocity of the Space Wolves, Bile made his own plans for retreat. The primogenitor had not lived so long or with such care to chance his life when the odds turned against him. With a contemptuous sneer, Bile keyed a teleporter Homer on his belt, vanishing in a flare of crimson light. Arjak helped Grimnar to his feet, the Great Wolf nodding to his champion in wordless thanks, before charging forwards to finish off the remaining traitor forces. What would have taken Bile days took Grimnar but a few hours, his enhanced senses finding the Wolf Brothers' stasis casket from amongst the thousands in the vault. With a drop of blood, the Wolf Lord opened the genetic lock and looked upon the face of the chapter's long-lost battle brother. Sorrow filled Grimnar's heart as he noted the signs of the Wolfen upon the ancient warrior, his Richter star frozen in time by the stasis field. It would be no kindness to awaken him, and so Logan closed the casket once more, ordering it returned to the Fang. There would be no redemption for this brother of the Space Wolves, but at least he had been spared the corruption by the powers of chaos. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. If you have enjoyed these stories, then do consider liking and subscribing, and tipping with a super thanks if I've earned your bounty this day. There is a link to the patron in the video description also, if you feel that generous. But more importantly, now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.